their music in their heart.
Very, very happy to be a part of it. I think it's very, very important for not just the Indian subcontinent, for us to be able to show to the world, hey, we can build these political bridges.
As you can see, we come to you from so many directions, bearing the gift of music. Please share in the joy we have in bringing this offering, this Gitanjali, to you.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that short presentation. This was our concert at the National Center for the Performing Arts in Mumbai on April 26th this year. We called it Chirag, as you know, and it was the launch event for the South Asian Symphony Orchestra. So I'm going to trace, in the brief time that we have for this session, my journey from diplomacy to orchestras. It is not such a long journey. One shouldn't assume that it was a long journey, because what is diplomacy? Essentially, it's the art of communication, of bridging divides, of connecting diverse sets of people together, diverse sets of people and nations, mediating conflict, and we have a lot of that in our region, building relationships, and of course, last but not least, and perhaps the most important aspect of all, preventing war and conflict. That is essentially what diplomacy sets out to do, and that is why people like us choose a profession like diplomacy. Mind you, diplomacy works very much in concert with the security elements of a government apparatus. Obviously, when you are in the foreign ministry, you work very closely with the defense ministry, you work very closely with the home ministry or the departments of the interior in some countries. So there is a lot of interconnection with other workings of government which often concern war and conflict. But the task of a diplomat is essentially to see how we can prevent confrontation, how we can build confidence among opposing sides, and to see how we can build a future of common progress and prosperity. As many diplomats like to say, we prefer win-win solutions, where both sides win. Successful diplomacy, therefore, solidifies peace, and failed diplomacy, of course, precedes war, as we have often witnessed in our times. Now, I was a diplomat by profession for almost 4 decades of my life, an interesting 4 decades spent at the ringside of history, as it were, working at transforming relationships with some of our neighbors, and witness, of course, to the slow and glacial and often almost paralytic pace of relations with other neighbors. And I don't have to mention names here, no prizes for guessing. We've had difficult relationships, particularly with our Western neighbor. We were all one country at one point, and at the time of independence, there was a partition of the subcontinent, and everything that has resulted from that, we are still dealing with the legacies of that division. So, in the time I was in diplomacy, and as a diplomat, I found that you learned to project your country's point of view to the best extent possible, to secure its interests, to look after our citizens abroad, to operate in different spheres, And whether they're concerned, as I said, security, commerce, political and economic analysis, and cultural projection and outreach. So that's also a very important part of diplomacy, just as political analysis or summitry. You see these summits that go on quite frequently when our prime minister goes abroad. But there's a whole army of people working under that surface trying to build bridges. And cultural projection is also very important in that aspect. Now, during my time, my career, I was also witness to the advent of a revolution in communication with the rise of the internet, as you all know, and the empowerment, and this is most important, the empowerment of ordinary citizens as they gained access to social media and the dismantling of traditional bastions of information control and dissemination, as more and more individuals took to expressing their opinions through Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. So the ivory towers really came tumbling down. So no more can a bureaucrat or a diplomat or a civil servant feel secure about the fact that they are comfortably positioned in their offices away from the madding crowd. That doesn't simply exist anymore. It doesn't operate on those wavelengths anymore. So no more ivory towers. You really have to practice, as somebody said, gumboot diplomacy. You have to walk in the slush. You have to feel the ground beneath you. You can't be at some, removed level where you're not in touch with the people. So all this I did sense through these revolutionary changes around me. I traveled the world and I saw this happening before my very eyes. Somebody said, today you're the naked diplomat. And you don't really have any protection. You are subject to the inquiries, the signals that you receive from the audience around you. You can say that diplomacy is conducted in an amphitheater today, and we are all gladiators. We're really thrown, as it were, into the arena, and we have to fight and survive and ensure that our interests are protected. But when I looked at the situation in our region, I referred to it at the outset, in South Asia, it had remained more or less the same. Of course, we have our developmental challenges in the region. We have, as I said, legacies of history. We have the leftovers of partition to deal with. We have territorial disputes. We have the lack of connectivity, the need for infrastructure to improve, the absence of people-to-people communication. How easy is it for us to communicate with our neighbors across borders? All that was changing, but changing at a very glacial pace. And when I left the Foreign Service and when I retired, and I had more time to myself to reflect on these realities, as it were, I felt to myself that while we in India were developing by leaps and bounds, many of our neighbors in the subcontinent were beset with various sets of woes, whether it was religious radicalism, whether it was civil war, whether it was stagnation of growth, whether, of course, you see it when you deal with many of our neighboring countries, there is a complex set of behavior patterns vis-a-vis India, because we are the biggest country in the region, and with bigness comes a lot of baggage. And I think our neighbors tend to have certain attitudes about India's role and what India has done in the region. We are the largest country in the region, so we have a responsibility, I felt, to building more bridges, to overcoming some of these prejudices and stereotypes. And there were clear divides, obviously, to be bridged in terms of communication, understanding, people-to-people contact, and most importantly, mutual empathy was in short supply. Mind you, we are a shared civilizational, cultural, ethnic space in many ways. South Asia, my friend, the assassinated foreign minister of Sri Lanka, Lakshman Kadirgamar, used to often say that South Asia is an integer. It's really meant to be more integrated. And look what you see with Southeast Asia. You look at the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. When you compare what ASEAN has achieved over the last 50 to 60 years, 55, 50, 60 years, and what SAARC has been able to record in terms of achievement, the South Asian Association of Regional Cooperation, I'm afraid the balance sheet doesn't look very good for us. So these were things that troubled me. They troubled me. They tended to haunt me. They kind of plagued the conscience, as it were. And with all these degrees of separation that I found existed in South Asia, and at the same time you have an information-based global order, it seemed to me that minds in the region were not open enough to new ideas of cooperation and coexistence, and that insularity was more often the rule than the exception, and ignorance and prejudice persisted, despite the fact, as I said, that we are a common civilizational and geographical space. We are witnessing climate change, a sharp depletion of natural resources. Look at the water crisis that some of our cities are facing. We're impacted by similar challenges of poverty, rising aspirations and expectations of populations, particularly the youth bulge, as we all talk about India and the rest of the region being young in terms of the demographics. But there's a lot of restlessness also among the youth. And I felt what was required here, apart from the paramount need for rapid and inclusive economic development, was also the development of a globalized vision that stressed a humanitarian agenda for the region, built on closer people-to-people ties and citizen-driven cultural diplomacy. I stand before you really as a citizen. I'm no longer a serving ambassador. I'm just an ordinary citizen. And I felt that given the experience that I had acquired when in government, and with the privilege and the exposure that I'd had to so many such situations, I should try and define a goal, which was to build more connections, more bridges, to bridge divisions, as I say, to transform outlooks, and inspire South Asia to think together, to harmonize, to empathize, and to shed suspicions of the other, the enemy, the neighbor. Often the enemy is the neighbor. And there was a need to build mutual confidence and build an image of South Asia for the rest of the world that could set a trend for cooperation like we see in other regions, as I mentioned, Southeast Asia. Take the instance of Germany and France 100 years ago, or even 70 years ago. I mean, they were at loggerheads, and look where they are now with the European Union, even though that community is facing many challenges. So I wanted to see how, as a citizen, I could at least take one small step forward to make South Asia like the rest of the world. And that's how the orchestra project really began. So about a year ago, what we did, my husband and I, was to set up a trust, a not-for-profit trust in Bangalore called the South Asian Symphony Foundation, with the goal being to set up an orchestra of musicians really from the region, from the 8 countries of the region. And you know, the 8 countries of South Asia, we begin with Afghanistan, and then you have Bangladesh, you have Bhutan, you have India, you have Nepal, you have the Maldives, you have Pakistan and Sri Lanka. So 8 of these countries. And beyond that, it's not over, as they say, it ain't over yet. We have so many people of South Asian origin who live in different parts of the world. You go beyond to Southeast Asia, you look at Singapore, you look at Malaysia, you look at the Fiji Islands, you look at the United States, Canada, Europe. You have people of South Asian origin, a lot of Indians, as we all know, in these countries. So my aim was to look not only at these 8 countries, but beyond to the people of South Asian origin who live of contact. So you may, does an orchestra perform in such a situation? It's a macrocosm, a microcosm, that macrocosm. It tells you about the diversity of our world. It tells you about audiences that can still influence each other. What they do is to demand discipline. They entail listening to each other, and something, I think, the art of listening to each other. It can't function if it doesn't create harmony to the other fields of life. Utopian as it may seem, but it's a practical utopia, as Daniel Barenboim once said. And I always say, in any map of the world, there has to be a place called Utopia. And that's really the story of our lives. We survive on hope, as it were. So the final output of the sound that you hear in the orchestra, you saw the movie, it's made from the contribution of individual orchestra members. They follow their cues, and they make their musical instruments speak. They articulate an expression that reflects nuance. It's very subtle. It's not just in your face. It's a subtle nuance that they are able to express. And they interpret things very accurately. They read the lines before reading between the lines. Very often we read between the lines before we even read the lines. So I think that is something which is useful. So the image of a symphony orchestra, as it were, is new to many South Asians. The older members of the audience may remember the days when we did have little bands and little music groups that played in bandstands across. In many small towns, you find a bandstand. Today, you don't find any musical event happening there. But we did have these little orchestras and bands in the old days. But today, with digitization and electronics, that seems to have become a thing of the past. Our film music, for instance, is usually digitally produced. But you look back at the old movie songs of the 50s, the 60s, 70s, and even 80s, there were orchestras. There were orchestras in Mumbai that were recording in studios for the composers who made these songs. So our orchestras have faded into oblivion, and I believe with it, the culture of collaboration. Just the culture of, disciplining oneself to work in a community. And it's not that talent does not exist in our region. I've discovered over the last year there's an enormous reserve of talent. People who are very, very qualified to play many of these musical instruments, who understand music, but who are waiting for an opportunity to come together and express themselves. So the challenge was to look at the various countries. We found such talent in Afghanistan. You saw these young kids. Some of them grew up in refugee camps. They're orphans. They don't have parents. They're at the Afghan National Institute of Music, learning both Afghan music is very tied to Hindustani music, as you may know. Hindustani classical music has many followers in Afghanistan. But Afghanistan at one stage was also a country that was looking to the rest of the world before the Taliban appeared on the scene and before the Soviet invasion changed it all. There were people in Afghanistan who were also looking at Western music and who were aware of the big composers of the West. And the Afghan National Institute has tried to bring both these things together. I don't like to use the word fusion when it comes to music. I think everything has its own identity and its own soul, and we must respect that. But we can see how we can bridge, different schools of music and thought in this field. And I think the Afghan National Institute of Music is an example that we can certainly look to. Nepal has a smaller group of people. They're much more in a sense, dispersed in terms of their talent, but we did find some good violinists. Bhutan, we just found a single person who was a pianist, and we didn't have a piano in the orchestra. The repertoire didn't include room for a piano. So we requested him to play percussion, which he did to the best of his ability. He was a great member, very collaborative. And that was essentially what we wanted, I'll play a little, maybe our computer expert, excuse me, sir. We need to play another short clip. I just want you to listen to the sole Pakistani American in our orchestra. We didn't get anybody from Pakistan. I don't know if they have people who do orchestra music, I wasn't able to find out. But through the diaspora, we were able to locate a double bass player in New York who's Pakistani American. And I'd like you to hear his story because in many ways, I think it epitomizes the story of our orchestra. I'm just trying to...
Personally, as my father was a Muslim man who, the main purpose of the South Asian Symphony Orchestra resonates with me quite personally, as my father was a Muslim man who was born and grew up in South India, in Kakinada, the Andhra Pradesh region of India, which from what I understand is not a very highly Muslim populated area. So my father grew up with a mixed group of people, religiously speaking anyway. I know his best friend was Hindu, for example, Raj. So when partition happened, my father's family didn't move. They stayed. They wanted to be where they were comfortable, where they knew people. And it was only after my father went to college in Aligarh that he was advised to go to Pakistan because there would be more opportunities. And he went, and I'm sure he was happy with the opportunities he had there, as he was very successful as an academic. But I don't think he really realized fully what the consequences would be of him not being able to go back to his home country ever, not to be able to see his mother's tombstone who passed away, his family, his friends. So I found that to be very sad. And it's something that's haunted my family from time to time, especially when we travel through and across South Asia. And ironically, here in New York, Indians, Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, we all get together because we just recognize immediately how similar we are, how culturally the food we eat, the languages we speak are also similar, that we just get together and hang out. So two of my friends, musicians, also, one is the Indian marriage of Pakistani. So for us, it's kind of strange to look and see all these differences and tensions that build up between people that are basically the same. So I really hope that the South Asian Symphony Orchestra can ameliorate the situation by showing our similarities and really having us to work together and be together and recognizing that we're really all one people. And I'm very happy to be a part of this project.
Thank you. So that was a short clip from Sadi Zain, who is of Pakistani origin, but American, living in New York. And he came to Mumbai for the performance of Chirag. He was there, the sole person who has some connection with Pakistan. I don't think he has ever lived there, but certainly his father was, as he said, from Kakinada and went to Karachi and then landed up in New York. And that is really the story of many South Asians, I think. It's difficult to say exactly where we come from and what our origins are, but we're South Asian. I'll tell you a little anecdote, maybe trivia. There are these DNA testing, sites these days. You can send a DNA sample to them and they come back to you. So there is an American site, and I was in Washington. I said, let me send off the sample and see what the results are. And I expected some very elaborate readout, to say that my origins were from X, Y, Z, different places on Earth, and, what makes up what we are made up as Indians, which obviously we are. Maybe the DNA site was not specialized enough, who knows, but the readout of the report when it came back was just one sentence. It said, 100% South Asian. So, so that's the story for you. We are 100% South Asian, whatever we are. And so the orchestra really proceeds on that. We can switch this off if you don't mind. Um, yeah. So I will stop here. I don't know, is there room for questions? Or? Okay. So as you see, we did the performance of Chirag in Bombay. We brought together about 75 musicians from the region. The Vice President of India was the chief guest, and he's been a great cheerleader for this project. And he wants us to do more concerts, bring more people together. It's really a peace-building, confidence-building, bridge-building effort that we have embarked on. Vijay Lakshmi Pandit, the sister of Jawaharlal Nehru, who was also in her own right a very accomplished woman diplomat, the first woman ambassador in the world to the Soviet Union and the United States. She used to say, let us sweat in peace rather than bleed in war. And I'll stop on that. Thank you. I think we'll take the lady first.
I can be loud enough. Is that okay?
You can just identify yourself also.
I'm Radhika Lobo. I'm Radhika Lobo. I'm a professor of economics. Now, what you mentioned right in the beginning, that France and Germany have had this animosity for so long, but they came together for larger economic benefits, and the European Union happened. So let me ask you the very obvious question. Didn't India and Pakistan see the larger economic benefits for SAARC to be a success?
Well, I think there is need everywhere, 360 degrees, for a 2020 vision. And especially since we're approaching that year, I think there's more need to focus on that. I think everybody knows that we should be collaborating more in the economic field. We should have more trade between each other. We should have more communication, more youth-level contact particularly. I don't think, we have to preach to the galleries about it. But somehow the fundamental issues in the relationship have kept us apart. You look at the issue of Jammu and Kashmir. I mean, how Pakistan looks at it particularly. You look at the issue of terrorism, which has become a hugely complicating factor in the last couple of decades, and particularly in the last few years. So there has to be a change of mind from Pakistan's side also. The people in the establishment, the people who really run that country. And they have a certain, mindset, a certain attitude vis-a-vis India. I often remember my visit to the Lahore Museum on a trip to Pakistan. I've been there many times, in fact. So I went to the Lahore Museum and I had a little time on one of my visits. And I looked at the section in the museum called The Freedom Struggle of Pakistan. So I assumed that the freedom struggle of Pakistan is very much like the freedom struggle of India. We were just one country. And, but the focus was on aspects which perhaps we include, but we don't make the center focus. So they talked about the Muslim movement, the war of independence in 1857, what the British called the mutiny, but we call the War of Independence. They looked at it as a Muslim war. I mean, the fact that Muslim sepoys in the British Army had risen up and fought for independence. So they had the kind of a slant when it came to interpretation of those events. So forget all that, and then it goes on to how Pakistan was conceptualized. And people like Rahmat Ali, how they defined the idea of Pakistan. There was a section on Rahmat Ali, his papers, his pictures. And in that section, there was a map of the subcontinent, a huge map, like from ceiling to floor. And the legend across it was undivided Pakistan. The legend across the whole subcontinent. So there are mindsets like that. I don't think we perhaps, you don't see much of that. Of course, we have, on our side also, we have some extreme views. But the largest common denominator here, I think, is very also common sense oriented. We've had partition, we have to accept the division, we have to get on with our future. So that's really the attitude that has to come from that side. I'm not saying that we as a big country don't have a responsibility. We have to keep patiently plugging away this line. We cannot afford to abandon it because the future of so many people is involved. But that's an answer to your question. Yeah, sorry.
Good morning, madam. I'm Dr. Somashekar. I was very much enlightened by your eloquent speech. For I believe firmly in the dictum, music is the sole medium for self-realization, sakshatkar, and it has no political, geographical barriers.
Do you want to ask a question?
It will do, your foundation will certainly do a long way in bridging the gap. That's my wish, because the long journey begins but with a single small step.
That's right.
I pray to the God, sense will prevail in our region, and peace can be established by, it may be a very, very small step, but certainly in the years to come, it will go a long, long way.
Thank you.
Thank you, madam.
The last question is to this young man here, and he's been waiting. You want a mic? Yes. Give him the mic, please.
Ma'am, thank you for the insightful speech. Ma'am, my intrigue for diplomacy started with the Cuban crisis and how diplomats stopped the nuclear war and so on. So my question to you is whether the current diplomats have that level of influence, that degree of influence in the world right now, or has that glorious phase passed?
You mean as far as India is concerned?
Yeah, as India and by and large as well.
Yeah, no, I think that diplomacy certainly has a role and a relevance and meaning in the 21st century world also, because problems persist, differences continue, war threatens to intervene, organizations break down. There's enough work for diplomats to do. And there's also the question of a country's profile and role in the region. And as far as India is concerned, you know, with our $5 trillion economy round the corner, the fact that we are such a huge market, that we have such a large manpower pool of especially scientifically trained people, and the fact that we are a living, pulsating, successful democracy, all that buttresses our image in the world. And therefore, it raises India's prestige and India's position. And we need to take strength from that. However much we may, within the country, have our, differences or competitions and different, groups and all that may, whatever the case may be, to the outside world, this is what we represent. Looking at our IT strengths, the fact that we are functioning well, we've had years of stability, we are on a fast growth track, and people notice that outside, and people respect that, and that certainly gives strength to any diplomat, especially from India.
Thank you, ma'am. It was really an inspiring speech. Thank you so much. And just accept a small token of gesture from us. Thank you. Now we are coming up. Okay. Now we are coming up with an Indian story of the Second World War by Raghu Karna and Mr. Nanda Karyappa. Please look forward to it. It's going to be very interesting too.
nuggets of wisdom. As a refreshing new voice in the Indian literary scene, writer Raghu Karnad, son of internationally acclaimed Girish Karnad, to World War II in his debut book. In conversation with him is retired Air Marshal Nanda Karyappa, discovering memories of World War II. Over to you, sir.
Are you going to start or should I? Please. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen,
I think you should hold it. No, it's on, just hold it close.
ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure and a great honor to be invited to discuss Raghu's great book, Father's Field. And I'm particularly delighted that his mother, Mrs. Karnad, is here. Before I proceed with quizzing and putting Raghu through an inquisition, I would like all of you to please join me, sit as you are, for a short period of silence in memory of that great thespian, a great human being, Girish Karnad, who passed away not so long ago. Please, we'll stand for this if you don't mind. 30 seconds in memory of a great human being, a great thespian, who left us all a short while ago. May his soul rest in peace. Thank you. I've taken the liberty of having read Girish's great book, Father's Field, to say how delightful and a wonderful read it is. He has researched it in great detail, and it is about war, the horrors of it, and as some politician has averred, that war is too serious a matter for soldiers. Well, that's probably because they never face the bullets. They don't lose close kin, and it's not their blood which is on the battlefield. Some of the opinions of this book, who've read this book, are truly and justifiably effusive about someone who is considered as one of India's most brilliant and talented writers. In fact, I would go to the extent of saying, and in fact we were talking about a short while ago, that he needs to perhaps change his profession to becoming, and I'm saying this seriously, a military historian, because he's gone through such...
What's my next war, sir? What do you suggest after World War II?
You can keep me as your flunky.
65?
Absolutely.
We can start the research now. I have a war hero right here, so we may as well get started.
As I was saying, his painstaking research has been truly rewarding for someone like me who has had peripheral knowledge of wars in 3 different theaters. In the Middle East, the Northwest Frontier provinces, and Burma. Sadly, man's inhumanity to fellow men, or fellow beings rather, does not draw a line either in terms of religious or social background. There are no ethics in war. All one hears of is a bloodlust that transcends across the globe. I will digress here a little bit and inject a somewhat related issue concerning Raghu, if I may say, his magnum opus. Over the last 2 years, the world has been commemorating the end of the war to end all wars. I'm talking about the First Great War. Alas, that was not to be, and as time events have shown, it's still ongoing. Poignant poetry has been written, including at least 2 wonderful pieces by a great Nightingale of India, I think she was called that, Sarojini Naidu. I had done some reading up about World War I for an event at Mangalore. However, it has been a revelation about, if I might say, my love affair with that wonderful community, the Parsis. I mention this today for 2 reasons. One is that Raghu's mother, Saraswati, and I belong to the same clan. And secondly, and because of her, and hence Raghu's Parsi connection, and he makes some very interesting characterization, which you will find in the book, and if I may quote.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, hold it as close to your mouth.
Okay. Parsis are pale as scalps, mad as coots, noses like commas on a page, devoutly civilized, consummately lawful, and from my fairly close association with them in the Air Force, with the most colorful vocabulary when it comes to either abusive epithets or terms of endearment, all in one. Many of their jokes would make a sailor blush. And on a more sublime note, however, their credo is good thoughts, good words, and good deeds. And if you may permit, I would like to describe the other half of his forefathers. And I'm quoting Raghu again. And whether he gets any brickbats for this, I don't know. A Kodwa of the arrogant tribe from the densely timbered, isolated hills northeast of Malabar, considered by their neighbors as dagger-bearing, bow-spearing, maiden-stealing treaders, worshippers of rifles and ancestors. Also, and apart from their unparalleled philanthropy, little known of their military reputation in World War I. I don't know if you're familiar with the British government. The British, I keep forgetting this. The British government had established there's a Parsi there, right?
A Kodwa battalion.
Had established a battalion in Bombay comprised entirely and only of
Parsi troops.
And they were commanded by Parsi officers. It never happened in any other Indian Army unit pre-independence. And to the extent lost about 50-odd troops, and a memorial has been erected in a Parsi colony in Bombay. And I don't know how many people are aware of this landmark in terms of Parsi soldiery. The service orders of the first, and in the 65 war, Colonel Tarapur was awarded the Paramveer Chakra, which is equivalent to the British Victoria Cross. The Parsis have, to buttress their military reputation, this tiny community has given our armed forces chiefs, one army chief, one navy chief, and of course the inimitable Field Marshal Sam Manekshaw. Having said, I now ask Raghu how he came to write this. I have found it to be, as I say, unputdownable because of being able to empathize with characters and essentially the profession of arms as a serviceman and as a pilot. This whole love story, it's about Parsis, it's about the war, and I will leave now the stage to Raghu it came about and what follows next.
Thank you so much. And before I start talking about the book, please allow me to say that the honor is all mine to be over here with you. I've spoken about the book at many events in many different parts of the world. So glad to be in Mysore for various reasons and profoundly honored to be speaking about it to you, sir, as a serviceman and as someone who is seen a prisoner of war in the service of India's defense. And not least the son and the carrying on the legacy of India's greatest modern soldier, I think it's possible to say without too much controversy. Someone who also figures in my book and whose life absolutely embodies all of the questions I was exploring, because he was the consummate the consummate figure who spanned this period from the end of the British Raj through the beginning of the modern independent Indian Army, which is Field Marshal Cariappa. So I'm thrilled, and I'm sure we'll get a chance to speak about the Field Marshal in a bit. I like that you used the word love story. Thank you for that. It is in parts a love story. I think that most war stories don't make a lot of sense unless they are love stories, because you can't really have a tragedy. There isn't much to experience of tragedy or loss unless there's love that precedes it or is waiting in the background that actually turns loss into tragedy. And that's essentially what happens in this book as well. This is a book about my maternal grandparents, my maternal grandmother's family and her generation growing up in Madras. Now, the thing is, it was a bit of a mystery to me too. Just like this Parsi memorial that's sitting in a bag somewhere unknown, all of the memories, all of the family stories that were related to my grandmother's brother, her husband, her brother-in-law were almost completely lost. At least I had never heard them. One day, a few years ago, while I was talking to my mother on the phone, she mentioned a man named Bobby. And Bobby had been my grandmother's brother, but I didn't really know who he was. And then she said, "Oh, Bobby, he was grandma's brother. He was in the Second World War." And I thought, my God, not only do I not know who he was, not only do I not know more, I didn't know his real name. It wasn't Bobby. I also didn't know anything about what Indians might have been doing in World War II. And I think of myself as someone who is well read in history, and I thought I knew about the Second World War. And I'm a journalist, and I also think of myself as someone who understands India's the story of India in the 20th century. And yet somehow it had never occurred to me that the overlap between Indian history and World War II history could be a really enormous chapter that somehow lost from view or kept out of view for us. And the story of my book is the story of me trying to solve the mystery of who these young men were, and through their eyes of what this whole enormous, amazing landscape was of India's Second World War. And to bring it home and to really kind of appreciate what is India's World War II. It sounds like another chapter in a Ram Guha book, which is now every chapter in a Ram Guha book is worth a few books in itself. But it may sound like a fairly minor episode. But I want you to think about other countries and what their World War II experience or legacy has meant for them, whether it's the United States, whether it's England or the United Kingdom, or any of the countries that were participants, the European countries. For most of these places, their literature and their movie making has just drawn continuously on their Second World War experience to create some of their greatest kind of artistic contributions. And if you think about modern American literature or modern British literature, if you think about Catch-22 and The English Patient and Norman Mailer, and I could just keep on going. The films and the books that those countries have built out of their World War II legacy are some of their greatest classics. And India was fighting World War II longer than the United States by quite a while. And what the Indian army and what Indian soldiers and their families experienced was as large, if not larger, than at least what the United States experienced in World War II. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that. So that's the size of the legacy that we have to recover if we can go back and get it. At least that's what kind of opened out in front of my eyes once I just sort of pushed open the door on the question of what is this war that my family was apparently involved in. And it's especially interesting to be, as I assume most of us are in this room, to be South Indian and to ask this question. Because at least for me, and it shouldn't be this way since part of my family, the Kodava side of my family belongs to the Kodandera clan, and the Kodandera clan includes the Air Marshal and his father, the Field Marshal. So there's a great kind of military tradition and valor in that family. But still, to me, to be South Indian meant that there's no kind of, there's no real modern military tradition or kind of legacy. You just associate all of the soldiering with the Punjabis and the Sikhs and the Rajputs and all of those communities that still have battalions named after them and are still kind of the most visible in Indian soldiering.
Raghu, if I might interject
Yes, please.
here. When Raghu talks about what were known as so-called military classes who joined the fighting army, what you have forgotten to mention is that the brains of the army in terms of the technical services, whether engineers, signals, electronics, most of them were from South India. Right. From whether they were Tamilian, Telugu, Malayali, Kannadigas, but most of the brains in a similar pattern, or if I can use the word, are how the Bangladeshis, the Bengalis were, the Bangladeshis. They served in the Pakistan Armed Forces. They were considered disloyal at the time of the Bangladesh War, and all of them, almost to the last man, decided to emigrate to their new homeland. And the moment they did that, the Pakistan Armed Forces, particularly Air Force, came a cropper in terms of maintenance of their aircrafts. So there was this intellectual capability. The Bengalis were never considered a militant martial race as such. And similarly, as Raghu was talking about the South Indian states, no, but the brains were all there. Whether it's a lot in the armed forces, the brains were towards maintaining the highly complex, going more and more on a daily basis, aircraft, ships, and anything. Of course, so there's a flip side to the brains when it came to scams and making pots of money. Back to you, Raghu.
Yes, exactly. Thanks for clarifying that. So, for me, as I began to explore this subject, it was like this series of revelations at multiple levels. It was, oh, my country has a history of World War II. Also, oh, South India and my regional neighborhood has a history linked to this greatest of all, largest of all human conflicts, to the extent that one of the chapters is about Madras preparing for a Japanese naval invasion. Actually happened, and it was a very dramatic episode. And then in the most personal level, that my family, and not distant family, but my own grandmother, who I grew up knowing very well and grew up close to, had lived through it and had lived through, through both the adventure and the very profound tragedy of it. And so obviously there was plenty to write about. And if anything, the challenge of my book was how much I could leave, because I found everything just marvelous as I looked around. But it's also sort of, for me, it was like solving a mystery. It started off with understanding that there were these three men whose stories I needed to track down. And in order to, and I just had a few clues. I had some letters, I had a few sort of citations to archives somewhere, and I had a few physical artifacts, a scroll that is the commissioning letter signed by the Governor General, and from there I had to figure out what led them out on these journeys, and some of them journeys from which some of them didn't come back alive. So that's the story of the book. And beyond that, there's an enormous amount to unpack, including these stories of Madras and the stories of what South Indians in particular why World War II is significant in this context. Why is it more significant to us? Is because something happened at the beginning. Okay, so Field Marshal Cariappa is the very first mover in a process that would end up becoming that would form the modern Indian Army, the Indian Army that that sort of serves the country today. And that is, he became an officer, right? So the distinction that defines the army of the Raj traditionally is that it has Indians in the ranks, and correct me if I'm wrong at any point, sir, and Europeans as officers. And this is something that is absolutely kind of the DNA of the army of the Raj because of what happened in 1857. The army of the Raj is essentially an army that's paranoid about a repeat of something like 1857, and so it's really designed very carefully to make sure that Indians cannot rebel, they don't have command, and that they can also be turned against each other by having kind of ethnically segregated groups, units. But because of political pressure, because of the kind of political work, the early political work of the Congress Party in the 20th century, the British begin to induct very few and very select Indians as officers, beginning around the time of the end of the First World War. And one of those was Field Marshal Cariappa, who was obviously not a field marshal then. On the contrary, he was a second lieutenant, exactly. And had to spend a lot of time, much longer than most officers, I believe, in lower ranks before he, in order to make the kind of progress that a European officer would make automatically. But then the Second World War started, and this this trickle of Indians who were allowed into the ranks that were commanding the army, suddenly the doors just blew open. Because suddenly the Indian army was going to grow 10 times its size. It was going to serve in 4 different continents, in every single war zone, where every theater of war where the British were fighting, Indians were fighting. They were going to be deployed everywhere, and the only way to serve this, to provide command for this suddenly expanded army, is to allow Indians to enter the ranks of command, to become officers for the first time. So this changes the constitution of the army completely, and that brings us which means that it was during World War II that the Indian army began to be taken into the hands. The command of the Indian army began to be taken into the hands of Indians themselves, as opposed to Europeans. Field Marshal Cariappa was always at the forefront of that, because he was always one of the senior most and one of the most highly regarded. And behind him were lots and lots of young men, and in a sense also some women, including the 3 young men in my book who were much younger and who signed up under various pressures, who would never otherwise have had anything to do with the Indian army, but who under one pressure or the other signed up and got sucked into the vortex of World War II, and then carried off across the world. Yeah.
I think Raghu's just given us a great sort of broad brush picture of the participation of Indian armed forces, particularly the army, in the Second World War. But the Second World War also had the horrendous 2 factors. One was the ongoing war in the Northwest frontier, and in Burma, which is sadly considered the forgotten war, because all the glory and all the approbation and everything else was focused on the West, not so in the East. And this is where your uncle, I think, pranged an aircraft, little Bobby, right? Who was killed in an air crash in, I think it was an air crash, no.
There are 3 of them, and one of them is an Air Force pilot.
In Burma.
Yeah.
And so what we've just heard from Raghu is a kind of background to the Indianization of the Indian Armed Forces, but it was spearheaded by people like his predecessors, going back, in fact, as I said, to the First World War, of which very little is known as the exploits of the Parsi community per se. And as I said, in that war, there were 2 distinguished service orders that were awarded to 2 Parsi doctors for the services that they rendered to the troops. And then you take this, there's a big hiatus between the First World War and the Second World War. And again, this is where people like General Timaya, Field Marshal Sam, that much younger, and others who really painted their names in gold and etched in the memory of our country. I would like, however, to say that we have such a, perhaps not as Indians, but I'm talking as a serviceman, but I find more in India than anywhere else. There's this lovely little piece of doggerel, which goes, at times of war, and not before, God and soldier we both adore. But when all is righted, God is forgotten and the soldier slighted. And sadly, this is the story of everyday life where armed forces personnel are concerned. And I hope that when Raghu does decide to take the bullet between his teeth, take the bit between his teeth, and he is going to follow up on a plan, hopefully to become a military historian, he will find a tremendous amount to unearth. And not that there's any dearth of this, but with the painstaking research that he's gone into this great book, I'm sure you will have a tremendous amount to contribute to military history and to the likes of me. Because if it wasn't for your book, I wouldn't have known about this Parsi battalion in Mumbai.
You know, there was something, so that one particular question that made World War II special for me, that distinguishes it from other wars in which Indians have fought. And I want to actually ask for your opinion about this. Right at the start, when it occurred to me, you know, when this mystery appeared in front of me, one of the first questions there was to ask was, okay, the peak of the Second World War, which was in the early 1940s, was also the peak of the Indian freedom movement. You know, Quit India was in late 1942, and the moment in which a kind of terror approached India, in which Madras was preparing for a naval invasion, for instance, was earlier in 1942. These they coincided, basically. So the question that someone like me asks, looking back on that, and when you think, oh, these boys from my family who are younger than I am now, much younger in fact, they signed up to fight that war in 1942, is how come they weren't on the other side? You know? What is the dilemma? How did they think about this dilemma or this paradox that lay before them, that they were going to fight for the British Empire, just as so many of their countrymen were fighting to be free of the British Empire, right? So this is the basic dilemma of that war, and that's what actually draws me to it, because it becomes simpler to understand in later wars. When we're fighting for when our army is aligned with our independent country, we don't have tough questions of the same kind. And then this dilemma resolves, but mainly because we forget it. We have Field Marshal Cariappa, who led India through its first war with Pakistan, and all of the officers who are our most elevated champions in the Indian Army because of the wars of 65 and 62 and 71 and so on. They all were people who signed up to fight under the Union Jack. And there's so there's a mystery about that. It just as my family members did in this book. Did your father ever talk about that? So what was his? How did he square? Or was there nothing to square? The fact that he was a genuine patriot to India of the most genuine order, but that his service had begun at a point when the Indian Army was a colonial army.
Well, I'd like to sort of, as a prelude to the question that Raghu just asked. First of all, this is not about my father; it's about his book. So we need to get that that priority right.
He's in the book. I could read a passage about
No,
him.
no, not so. And therefore, I would not like for a moment to steal thunder talking about what my father did or achieved in his lifetime, and so that it detracts from this great piece of literary work that we have been presented now.
Thank you.
And whether you have a military bent of mind or not, whether you look upon, well, we're all Indians, and I keep saying this, however, that I think the last bastion of integrity in our country are the armed forces. Otherwise, it's all a question of I, me, and myself, and nothing else matters. So this is how it was with this Parsi family, who, if I'm not wrong, originated in Calicut. And then they came into Chennai. His grandmother and grandfather both became doctors, and the grandfather was in the Northwest Frontier. And it's all there, so lucidly described in this book. And I would reiterate a request that two of them, in fact. First of all, it does his coffers a lot of good if you buy the book. Secondly, it's a great opportunity for selfies, getting him to sign your book, because right now he was flooded outside by a large number of very attractive young ladies, all happening to be wearing blue or black shirts. They knew he was going to be like this. So, as I say, this whole thing is about him and his book. And therefore, I would ask that we leave my father out of it. We leave those soldiers, sailors, airmen, and indeed women who were part of the Second World War. And now, unfortunately, more and more women are coming into the armed forces, and it's great for us. I think they're doing the armed forces a great deal of good. We need them. They're unreliable. And when Mrs. Day was talking earlier about women and empowered women, I think much as I'm delighted that they're there, I would draw a line in terms of what they're going to do in the Air Force per se, as combatants. But coming back again, I'm sort of digressing, and I come back to you, Girish, to say that you've done so much, so Girish, forgive me, Raghu, so much hard work and research into your book that it's, I take my hat off for all that you've done. And it has, to me, it's been a great learning curve as to a lot of my knowledge has been greatly enhanced. Thank you very much for that. Are we through, or are we going to, I don't know how we have for time. Would you like to say something?
I think we have to offer our friends in the audience a chance to ask questions. But I don't know. Am I audible? Sure, I guess.
In front, yes, but perhaps not in the back. Would you like to?
There's a mic.
A very good afternoon to both of you. So my question here is to basically Raghu Karnad. I'm someone who's interested in reading about First World War and India's participation in that. My BA project was based on the entire participation of India. So there were certain limitations that I had while I was doing the research and getting consequent sources for doing it. I wanted to know what your limitations were while you were reading on the Second World War, and I'm pretty sure there were big hurdles to come over to get to the sources that you did. And the second question was about, there have been certain contributions by the princes of India while they did in the First World War, quite notably of the Maharaja of Mysore as well. I wanted to ask, are these contributions of the Indian princes while they were there a part of the Second World War as well? Were there certain contributions, like Mysoreans also paid taxes and they paid money to the Imperial War Fund when they gave money in the First World War? Okay, I'll cut this short. So that was a question. Was there anything similar in the Second World War?
Yes, you're right. The Second World War was more politically controversial in India, and because India had more mature politics, the Congress Party was large. We had, we already had that 1935 constitution, and but the princes were broadly speaking, remained very loyal and contributed a lot. They contributed troops, but they also contributed in interesting ways. For instance, suddenly India needed to build a lot of airstrips. Now, for the first time, India was fighting an aerial war. And so there was a lot of land that the Maharajas of Jodhpur and so on sort of allowed for the development of India's first aviation infrastructure. I love this question, and frankly, the mystery that presents itself when you find something that you never knew before is deepened as you piece together, as you kind of gain what you can. But there's always gaps in the record, and the mystique of those gaps never goes away. So for me, the biggest gap was, and you said you're interested in World War I, right? World War I ended 100 years ago this year, right? World War II ended 75 years ago this year. What's the most important distinction between those two? If a war ended 75 years ago, or if any event took place 75 years ago, then some of the people who were young, but not new one, who were young people are still with us. Not many. They're still alive, and they're still there to share their stories. When I was writing the book, which was 5 years ago, more of them were alive. And when I began writing, it was about, it was 6 or 7 years ago. So, to me, I think a lot about while I was writing it, the centenary events of World War I were happening, and they were very kind of largely celebrated, and especially in the United Kingdom, they kind of, they filled the Tower of London with hundreds of thousands of poppies and so on. But I thought there's something strange about celebrating a centenary this way, because a centenary kind of marks the point at which anyone who remembers that event is gone. We should be celebrating 75th year anniversaries, because that's how we mark the point at which the people who remember those events are still with us, and it's our last chance to commune with them about these events. And so, this moves me a lot, because the process for me, and it began with me and my mother essentially hunting down relatives, Kodavas, Parsis, others, Tamilians, in Palghat, in Calicut, all over the place, and then Chandigarh. Anytime I heard about someone who was a nonagenarian, I was knocking on their door 5 minutes later. And it was very, very enriching and moving experience, because, to be very blunt, most of these people were people in the final stage of their lives. And they weren't necessarily very well. Some of them didn't have their memories in good order. But sometimes if I was interviewing a former officer, his wife would remember all of his stories, and so I would get these stories from her, and he would kind of a very important contribution there is from Nirmala Kurian, who's married to Varghese Kurian, who plays a very, very important part in this story. He was also Bobby's classmate in the Guindy Engineering College. But there's something so moving about meeting people, because we're all, if we're lucky enough, going to be in this position, about meeting people in the last stage of their lives and asking them about the period in which they were young, in which their adult lives were just beginning, and it was full of adventure. They were traveling into the world, into the war. They were meeting the women or the men who were going to be their partners for the rest of their lives, who are they going to marry. It was so romantic. And of course, everyone remembers those things quite well. You might not be able to remember what you did that morning, but I heard wonderful stories and incredibly enriching stories. So the most kind of genuine thing that I can answer to your question, although there's lots of interesting things to say about archives and how we should be maintaining our archives, and there are a few institutions that I really want to credit. One of them being the Center for Armed Forces Historical Research at the United Services Institute in New Delhi. I was just talking to Sir about this. But the archive that we all have, and that is sort of in all of our hands to preserve, is the archive of the oldest people in our families and in our communities. And I really think that schools should teach history at least modern history, around about whatever was 75 years ago, you know? And then every year we could go and our students could help us build the archive of of our history by talking to their grandparents. And, you know, because then one of the great regrets that I lived with while writing this book is that I never got to talk to mine about that. Yeah. So that's the answer to that.
May I? I'm Asha Vombatkere. I enjoyed reading your book, and I think you do look like Bobby. But you said something about why USA and UK and so many European countries celebrate the Second World War. Why don't we? Why don't we remember it? Is it because we fought for a king and another country? Or is it something in our psyche which prevents us from really celebrating wars? Is it because, like you said, we had that dichotomy about whether we were fighting for our own country or fighting for the colonial powers under which we were suffering? Or is it something in the Indian psyche which doesn't give so much importance to that kind of history? What's your take on that?
So that's the answer to that is in a sense, my book is one way of answering that question. But also, so nice to meet you. I believe that Asha Vombatkere is married to Lieutenant General Sudhir Vombatkere. Sorry, Major General. Another retired officer who I admire very highly. You know, so part of the answer to this is inscribed in the center of Delhi, where India Gate dominates the entire city, our national capital. And it's a memorial to Indians who fought in World War I and in the Afghan wars before that, right? So it's very visible. But more Indians fought in the Second World War, and there's no memorial to that. Now that we have a national war memorial which begins to commemorate soldiers, starting with the war of 1947, we have World War I and the Afghan wars, and then this kind of silence, and now 47 onwards. So World War II has a special, it's not just that we were fighting for the British, or that we were fighting for the British Empire, it's that it has a specially awkward place in our national biography, or our national autobiography. And it has to do with the timing. It has to do with the fact that 2 years, to the date, because the Japanese surrender was signed on August 15th, 1945. 2 years later, India was free, the British Empire was gone. India and Pakistan were now two different countries. The army was cleaved apart as well. The timing of that war meant that it was particularly hard to carry to carry those stories into our new national story. And that what we would tell instead, when we tell the story of the 1940s, that we would just tell the story of basically the Congress movement and the INA, which is another wonderful kind of development, which is an offshoot of the Indian Army, because all of the original members of the INA were Indian Army soldiers. So it isn't just that we are setting aside all of our colonial history, because I don't think that's the case. It's that the proximity made it necessary to forget. But that proximity also tells you something, which is that the Second World War was an absolutely crucial part of the reason India became independent when it did. And what happened to the Indian Army, which is what I described slightly earlier on, is an absolutely crucial part of that explanation as well. And how the INA figures in it is a crucial part of that explanation as well. So by leaving out this somewhat inconvenient history of India and World War II, we're also leaving out the actual history of our national, you know, an actually like essential part of our nationalist movement and of our journey towards the freedom movement. Because the Indian Army didn't just fight on the wrong side. It transformed over the course of World War II and became the army. And you have to, this is too much to explain, but you have to, the book is about that as well, and became the army that would serve an independent country seamlessly. And that's the amazing thing about it. And it helped make independence happen just when it did.
Ma'am, may I interject here and say, in answer to part of what you, question that you'd asked of Raghu, that I think in India, we consider it, unless you have direct involvement, relationship with a person who's given his or her life, it means very little. And at home in Kurg, till barely 3 years ago, there was no war memorial dedicated to those who were killed post-independence. Now that is just that much, I would say 70 years ago. The one cenotaph that there is was erected by the British government to the gallant soldiers of Kurg who gave their lives in the 1939-45 war. Since then, we have been able to get money, not from government, but from service headquarters, Army, Navy, Air Force, and a small war memorial has come up in what is going to be known as the General Simaya Museum Complex. But this is the sad thing, that unless you are directly affected, one way or another, relations, cousins, daughter, whomsoever, it means very little. There's not that kind of flag waving that you attribute or see in the West, perhaps even in the East, whether it's in North Korea or China or Japan. It doesn't seem to be in our psyche, or it's inconvenient to bring up things which is history, and yet we sort of use history so much as a reason to explain who and what we are.
Thank you. We are over time. Maybe we have time to quickly take one more question.
You talked about INA, and there is a very sensational work of Subhash Chandra Bose, and more so in the recent history. What's your take on Subhash Chandra Bose and facts around him?
Well, yeah.
And also like British Indian Army also contains Indian soldiers. It was a fight between Indians and Indians. Like Second World War means even better. Like,
well,
actually I had the same question. So in your speech you had talked about how there was a dichotomy in the thought of Indians. How Field Marshal Cariappa, in spite of being an Indian, he chose to sign up with the British Army of the British Indian Army. Mm-hmm. And on the other hand, you had Netaji, who formed the Indian National Army, who chose to take military help from the Axis powers and even set up a provisional Indian government at Andaman for a few months. Yeah. So Indians did have a choice, like the masses of Indians who chose to sign up to fight, they did have a choice on ultimately which force to join. So how do you think that played out in the psychology of Indians at the time?
Okay, well, we could really dig in deep here, but I'll try to not do that. The shortest answer I can give there is that Netaji and other incredible people like Captain Lakshmi Sehgal went and found their way over to the other side of the trenches in order to fight as Indians against the empire, right? But nearly all of the Indian army that Netaji received when he formed the Indian National Army, or when he took over as the commander of the Indian National Army, were surrendered soldiers, or soldiers who had been surrendered by their commanders in the fall of Singapore and in Malaya and so on. So they had not chosen to fight in the INA. They were Indian army soldiers who had been surrendered by their commanders and then been redeployed under new command. Okay. What that shows to me, and I'm not an expert in INA history, I want to underscore that, though I'm pretty sure that Netaji did die in 1945. Just going to put that out there. I know there's a lot of talk about that otherwise, but I've looked into this very closely, and many people have. And unfortunately, I don't think he's coming back to help us. But what that means to me is that the divide and the dilemma between loyalty and liberty, or between serving and rebelling, was not one that falls between the Indian Army and the Indian National Army. It's actually one that runs through most of the people on both sides of that. Everyone who is in the INA, many of the people who are in the INA had seen both. They had served the Indian Army, now they serve in the INA. Many of the people who were in the Indian Army, especially if they were officers, like the people we're talking about, they were politically educated, they felt that dilemma too. So the divide isn't one, and in my mind, the divide is not one between the Indian Army and the INA, it's one that runs within everyone on both sides. So that's how I understand it.
I think we have to wind up. We're through? Yes, I think so. Well, we've just had a great exposition, if I might say, by Raghu on his wonderful book. And I would reiterate once again, apart from being his agent and getting you to buy his book, to have a thought, think of our men and women who are out in the front, and because of them, you're sleeping well at night. And may God bless them and help in keeping our country and our borders safe. God bless them all. God bless you.
Thank you. Jai Hind.
and has co-authored a book, Nothing Private About Relations, with M.B. Jairam, to be launched soon. Chandan Gowda, who is a professor of sociology at Azim Premji University, will be in conversation with Niranjan Nikam. He has translated U.R. Anantmurthy's book Bara and has been the editor of The Way I See It, a Gauri Lankesh reader, and has also edited Theatres of Democracy, selected essays by Shiva Vishwanathan. A Life in the World, a book of autobiographical interviews he did with U.N. Anantmurthy, will be published later this year. He is presently completing a book on the cultural politics of development in old Mysore state. He writes a weekly column on culture and politics in Bangalore Mirror. Now, I request you to listen to the views on Mahatma Gandhi and Hind Swaraj. Welcome.
Good afternoon. Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. I know, some of my friends are here. This is very strange that I have been pitchforked into this session because it was the session on by Naveen Chawla, the book that he had written called Every Vote Counts, the story of Indian elections. But unfortunately, he is not here, and the vote that was to be counted now is lost. And, then there was a crisis, a sort of crisis, and then anyway, Professor Chandan Gowda was to be in the panel with him, and so he had prepared, and in fact, I was so well prepared to interview Naveen Chawla, because I read the book. The moment I heard that Naveen Chawla is coming, I was very keen on interviewing him. I was in Bangalore last week. The whole day I went through the book. Then I even had an appointment with him. Probably yesterday it should have happened, and I would have finished the interview by the time he came here. But that is not meant to be. And suddenly then this crisis happened, and Chandan Gowda, my friend Shubha, called him up and said, look, this is what has happened, so what are we going to do? And Chandan, whom I have known for a very long time, being what he is, an expert, he suggested this topic called Hind Swaraj, or the Indian Home Rule. Now, why is this important? Because, and he also mentioned that, this is the 150th year of the birth anniversary of Mahatma Gandhi. And then he told Shubha, look, there is nothing about Mahatma Gandhi that we have in this third edition of the Literature Festival. So why don't we, at least now that we have a chance, talk about it, because this is so important and so contemporary. And suddenly, then who was the person that has to be in conversation with him? Then like a fool and idiot, said that I would do it, without even realizing what I was getting into. And, then Chandan sends me the soft copy of Hind Swaraj at around 11 o'clock in the night on Friday. And that day was a very busy day for me. But then I go and sit and just run through the book. Because when I was doing my high school, my English teacher was telling me that, whether you understand or not, you must read it. So that's what I did. And, this is something that is mind-boggling. This Hind Swaraj, whatever little I understood about it, is mind-boggling. Because this is a conversation which Professor Chandan Gowda is going to speak on about the book, but this is a conversation between a reader and an editor. So I'm supposed to be a features editor in Star of Mysore, but Mahatma Gandhi, as you all know, was a journalist. He was an editor. So now let me start, Professor Chandan Gowda. Now, what is this Hind Swaraj all about, and why is it so important in the contemporary times that you suggested that this should be the book that we should discuss?
Thanks, Niranjan. There's a reason why Niranjan hadn't read this book all these years. The book itself dropped out of public discussion after independence. Oddly enough, you had a stray Lohia talking about it, but most people didn't read the book. Until the 80s and the 90s, when Medha Patkar and these sorts of anti-development movements started picking it up. And then you had this Canadian political philosopher called Anthony Parel, who issued an inexpensive annotated edition of Hind-Swaraj in the mid-90s. And that renewed interest in Gandhi's thought in a different sort of way. It was released in the series on the Cambridge texts in modern politics. So all of a sudden, you had political philosophers who may not have taken him seriously as a political philosopher, taking him seriously in academic circles. You have 4 or 5 books that have been written on Gandhi. There's a reason why they found Gandhi interesting at that time. And as you know, everyone now is talking about the crisis in liberal thought, crisis in liberal democracies. And here you have a thinker who doesn't have much to admire in liberal democracy. And his model of organizing a society is something completely different and at odds at every level with the models of liberal democracy. And so you have a fascination with this thinker who's not illiberal, but who is not liberal in the fashion politics had come to be. So there's that context for why the book has become important. But then when you read it, and I hope all of you will read it sometime soon, you will realize how utterly original the book is. Like Niranjan said, it is structured in the format of a conversation between a newspaper editor and a reader, which itself is interesting because he could have easily said Guru Shishya talking and made it seem like this traditional conversation, but he doesn't do that. It's very much a modern Indian conversation and trying to thrash out fundamentals of what constitutes freedom in the Indian colonial context. And as you know, everyone felt getting rid of the British and acquiring political control was what we wanted. But Gandhi says, well, that is not as important as having a clear sense for what freedom means in the first place, and that is to be achieved at the level of one's self. So self-rule, Hind Swaraj, having a rule over oneself, is something that you seek after while you seek after political freedom. In fact, they're integrally linked. So the model of liberal democracy that says there is a state, there are the institutions, and then you have your private life where you can do what you want is something that Gandhi just doesn't accept. The quality of the state and the quality of yourself are all deeply interconnected. And a very quick word on the context of the book. It's actually Gandhi writes this in 9 days on a ship on his way back from England to South Africa. The immediate trigger perhaps was the killing of a British official by an Indian expat in London, Madan Lal Dhingra. It's possible that that was weighing heavily on his mind. He was trying to say that's not the way to think about Indian freedom. But like we know, the creative process is far more mysterious than one instant event triggering of a book. It's probably have been maturing in him for a longer period of time. But he writes it in Gujarati. There's a nice annotated edition by another set of scholars, Tridip Sahrud and Suresh Sharma. Both of them know Gujarati, and they say he's written the book with his left hand and the right hand. Whenever the right hand got tired, he wrote it. So it's a kind of a continuous writing, and they even quantified 38 of the 271 pages were written in the left hand, etc. But it was serialized in Indian Opinion in a journal in South Africa, in Gujarati first, and then Gandhi translated it himself into English, and this is the only book of his that is translated himself. As you know, even the autobiography was done by Mahadev Desai. He only wrote in Gujarati and others took care of the translation. But this he did it himself, and he wouldn't let anyone change anything. And a text that he went back to over and over again.
But yes. The book was banned. When he wrote it in Gujarati, I believe the book was banned. Yes. And when he translated it into English, I believe it was accepted because the British felt that no intellectual will read it. So. Yes, your take on that?
Yeah, it may have appeared less harmful than it seemed from the outside.
Yeah.
Because along with the Gujarati Hind Swaraj, Gandhi's translation of Ruskin's Unto This Last was also banned. And Plato's Defense of Socrates was also banned, which also Gandhi translated. Anyway, there's a paranoia about something that you can't access.
So that trend is continuing now, banning of the books still continues. No, again, the chapter-wise, if you go, there are so many interesting chapters that are there. One is it talks about civilization and the new civilization. Can you touch upon it a bit? Because that's very interesting. His take on civilization and the new civilization.
Yeah, thanks, Niranjan. Parts of the conversation are polemical in nature. I mean, if you look, there's a chapter called What is Civilization, and it's 2.5 pages long. And What is True Civilization is another 4 pages long. I mean, you would expect big tomes to be written on with titles like this. But he is very, very clear that he's clarifying an existing discussion as a means of going ahead. And he has these broad brushstroke definitions. And for him, civilization is something that makes bodily welfare the chief object of man, as he calls it. So civilization is wedded to the idea of increasing material life, improving material life, whereas true civilization, which he'll answer a few chapters later, doesn't have anything to do with the material world at all. If Europe said we have trains, we have these great buildings, we have these roads, we have signs, this is civilization.
Gandhi seems to have a contempt for that.
He has a contempt for that, or an indifference.
Indifference.
An indifference, and a cultivated one. For him, civilization tells everyone the path of one's duty.
When you say cultivated one, what do you mean by that?
No, it's been building up over the years. Because you don't find him ever being drawn to these things.
Yeah, because the cover page of the book, when it was first published, I think you see Gandhi with the suit and the bow tie and all that.
I don't know this detail now.
Yeah. So that changes happen slowly. And regarding the civilization also, there is so much.
So his definition of civilization, just to finish this thing, was about, it shows to man the path of one's duty. So here you will see it is not an organized religious codification of what one's duty is. It's left to each one to figure out what their dharma is. It is remarkably individualistic in that sense. It's about your conscience, it's about what you think is the right thing to do. He's saying that is civilization, which tells you what's the right thing to do.
What is so original or novel about Hind Swaraj, according to you?
I think many, interesting you use the word original. Gandhi's foreword, he will say, this is not an original argument. He says, I've got it from a variety of sources. Most Indians think like this anyway, and thousands of Europeans also agree with me. And I've got it from various writers, Tolstoy, Ruskin, Thoreau, and the Bhagavad Gita and the Upanishads and Tulsidas, all of them matter. So he's giving credit everywhere. But he says it's also mine. The book is also mine in the sense I wish to act according to this. My argument, I need to embody it in my own life. But what is original about it, if looking at it from now, from today's vantage point, in terms of his confident disregard for the value of historical thinking as a means of relating to the present is very, very important. If modernity meant having a historical imagination, and if people who didn't think historically meant they were not modern, Gandhi is quite comfortable to say that he has no use for history. So when you have the reader in this book telling him about why shouldn't one seek revenge when one knows that Muslims have indeed destroyed temples? There's evidence for these things. Shouldn't we be taking revenge? And Gandhi's response is not an historical one to say that, oh, Hindus have also destroyed Muslim shrines, etc. It is just to say, don't brothers in a family fight. Yes. So you're trying to proceed to address a crisis in the present, not through taking recourse to marshalling counter evidence from the past, but through producing an ethical picture of how one must be thinking of this matter. So that I find very, if you remember, so much of contemporary discussions and controversies are around historical claims and counterclaims. And we can't wish away the place of history. I think courts are here, there's a lawyer here, they will ask for historical evidence to settle matters. But Gandhi is refreshing because he'll continue to push you to think of non-historical ways of thinking of addressing a problem, which essentially means you have to be grounded in the world of moral imagination, which, gives you rich resources to think, ethical resources to think about problems without having to show historical evidence to back up whatever you're arguing for. That's one thing that I find absolutely refreshing in Gandhi, and we owe it to Ashish Nandi, who built upon this insight to actually say Gandhi was able to recover confidence against the colonizers through this means of setting aside historical imagination as a necessary one. Having said that, Gandhi is not uninterested in the past, or at least he invokes the past very, very frequently. But it's a strange past. It's not an historical past. So he will say, whenever a king did something immoral, legally wrong, the villages vacated their villages and protested, say sat in dharna. The idea of dharna for him goes back, and people have always known protest. So this is something that he'll bring to our attention as a means of saying this mode of protesting is an old... It always existed. Also, if you look at the image of the past that he produces for us, he will constantly say in arguing against machines, for example. Our ancestors didn't want to, not that they couldn't have invented machines if they wanted to, but they didn't want to as long as the plow was working just fine. As long as an existing house was serving you just fine, why do you need a more comfortable house, etc.? Saying that, he says they were interested in the proper use of one's hands and feet.
No, in fact...
And that's an extraordinary image, because when one thinks of ancient India, you think of Vedic texts, you think of kings, you think of these great philosophical, theological discussions, but never the fact of hard manual labor as the image of the past. And he's doing it very beautifully, effortlessly.
No, but he does talk about the railways and the lawyers and the doctors, and he says there is no use for even the railways. And being in the profession that he was in as a lawyer, he questions the lawyers and he talks about the doctors. So what is...
he has...
It's very interesting that, because you can't accept some of the things that he says. For instance, the Singer sewing machine that is so delighted about, the invention of the Singer sewing machine.
Yeah.
But then the reader asks, you are interested in that, then why do you question the machinery?
Yes.
So these are the many dichotomies and the many confusions that he creates in our minds when we read it.
Yeah. Thank you, Niranjan. Gandhi is sure that most people don't realize that the modern civilization is a problem because it's like a dream. When you're dreaming something, you're believing in the dream. So you'll have to be woken up. And he does it by striking at fundamentals. If you thought railways are here to stay and they were a good thing, he will say, they carry diseases and they encourage immoral trading practices. If you have surplus grain from a famine-struck area, the traders there could use trains to sell them elsewhere and make a profit even when they were suffering where the grains were grown. So he has these arguments to say that, we should be able to think without trains. And as you know, he would say, going to a pilgrimage means walking and enduring the experience of walking long distance as part of the darshan. It's not independent of that. If you have a train, it lets you get there fast. It affects the overall, his understanding of a serious life is deeply undercut by machines like that. But he's also not a fundamentalist about these things. When Niranjan said he appreciates the Singer's sewing machine, someone has told him that Singer's wife was, couldn't see clearly and she was struggling hard to pass the thread through a needle, and which is why her husband felt like coming up with a sewing machine. If that was a source of his sort of creative provocation, Gandhi felt a human instinct was lying behind it, and it was something that we would have to welcome. But the reason he's against machinery in general is that it discourages you from exerting your, making physical effort. So if modernity is about the disappearance of physical effort, where machines take the place of work, if that is being fantasized in science fiction or in ideas of utopia, the future is one where people are not working, where work is seen as a bad thing. Toil is a bad thing. If machines can displace work, it's a good thing. So not for Gandhi. For Gandhi, work is an integral part of the good life, and machines come in the way. And they also produce horrible things like the factory, which assembles hundreds of people on a shop floor and it's a work experience of a horrible kind.
Yeah, and in some place he also mentions about the freedom, and then he says, if the English live here, if they don't, quit the country, then probably India, instead of being called Hindustan, could be called Englistan. So that is very interesting. That
yeah, his famous rebuttal of the reader. So you want the English rule without the Englishman. He's trying to say that you want the parliamentary system of government, you want the modern economy, you want everything that they have created, but you want to be ruling, that's all. If that's your idea of freedom, I think it's a very limited one and not a good one. I think that's the argument. And he's never othering the English. He's constantly saying, well, Englishmen themselves know the problems that they've created. He's constantly reaching out to critical voices outside.
Yeah, and it
which makes him not a nationalistic thinker, at least in these. He's not saying we are Indians and we shall evolve a way of life our own. That's not the argument. The argument is we should be true to the genius of the land, but that's not an exclusivist gesture.
Yeah, when you say the genius of the land, he does talk about the rich civilization that we have and how we have held on to it, whereas other civilizations have disappeared. And that is what the greatness about it is, and how Western civilization could even disappear, whereas Indian civilization will still hold on.
Yes.
So that is his, so what is your, when he talks so strongly about it?
This is why I said, it's not clear how to characterize this text.
Yeah.
So this might seem like, optimism unbounded, right? And unbound, but I think he's trying to build up courage among the readers. See, while you're trying to recover confidence against a false picture of the world that you've internalized, you say shed that image, you're also trying to, build courage in you. A lot of Gandhi's, thoughts on civil disobedience is about fearlessness. How do you conquer fear within? I would imagine this to be part of that enterprise.
Yeah, and he talks a lot about education itself, about what is it that he really speaks on about education then and now, in that sense.
So there again, he's trying to say, why must the education system that the English have introduced seem so naturally useful for all Indians? He will say, a peasant, what is an education for a peasant, for a farmer? If he knows how to farm and how to go about his earning his livelihood, for us to insist that he also pick up English education to feel educated, he thinks is a mistake. So he's not against education in general, but he's trying to argue against an uncritical acceptance of one model of industrial education. Right? The education that the British have introduced is essentially for industrial society. You have mass literacy, allows people to move across a country and acquire literacy enough to make them competent to be hired anywhere, to move across various workplaces, etc. A standardized literacy model. So he will ask for a pluralism there. And of course, the place of Indian languages is very crucial for him.
In what way is the Hind Swaraj relevant for the present contemporary politics that we are talking about? And before that, I'm sorry, in what way is the Hind Swaraj discussion that important for the present contemporary politics? And before that, let me also say that Gandhi nowadays, there was a time we call him the Mahatma, but that very word is now being questioned. And there are people who say that, Gandhi was the biggest propagandist. In fact, it is somewhere I read here, it's very interesting. He says that the objection to him is that he promoted himself through his writings. And, so what is so great about him that you call him the Mahatma? Why is it that, so those are the questions that we are facing now. And the way that things are moving, and the current politics, probably even the Rajghat could be destroyed and say, no, he is not the Mahatma anymore, so we'll demolish the Rajghat. So, these are the thoughts that come to us nowadays. And in that context, how relevant is he to the contemporary politics? Because I think we have all, slowly people are moving away from him. But as I always say, you can agree with him or disagree with him, but you cannot ignore him.
I think there's much of value in this book, especially. If you look through this book, I mean, it's not a practical manual, right? There's a philosophical vision here. And if you look at the book he wrote in the short tract called Constructive Program, that is a more practical application of what he elaborates here as a good way to think about freedom. The question of relevance and irrelevance will be a tough one. I mean, you can keep arguing the world is a financialized system. What are you talking about, a decentralized economy, etc. But for me, there are many parts of the argument that are extraordinarily valuable, especially given the context you just alerted us to. Yeah. Just to pick up one thing, his indifference to the state, his indifference to state power is extraordinary. He will say, again invoking a vision of the past, that in the past, the kings never were valued as highly as the fakirs and the saints. And as you know, we have a tradition that has valued kings and their valorous deeds and their adventurousness. We've also had another tradition that has tried to say the pursuit of power is not worthwhile, ultimately, and the pursuit of other ends is more worthwhile. You have the saintly tradition here. Gandhi, not only does he align himself with the saintly tradition, he thinks that's the only tradition. And that is extremely valuable in the contemporary times when you're talking about a fascination for the state, for nationalism that thinks the state should be empowered more and more to do the bidding of a certain group of people who control the state, etc. This understanding that state power is not the most valuable thing, and one must master one's passions. See, when he talks about true civilization, he's talking about true civilization is one which asks you to master your passions and restrain yourself. Again, what Gandhi is doing is a stroke of genius. Very quietly, what used to be an ascetic model of life, which only a few were invited to pursue if they were bold enough, he is trying to generalize it to society at large. The living simply, mastering your passions, curbing your desires, he thinks is the way to be. And when you endorse this manner of thinking about oneself, as opposed to the self that says indulge yourself, you have just one life to live, life is short, enjoy to the fullest. Imagine the other model, which is what he's equating with modern civilization. When you have this other model guiding the way you envision human relations at large, I think you have an extraordinary check against the advancement of a certain kind of fascistic tendencies. I think that for me is very valuable. Of course, his idea of a non-violent economy, these sorts of things are still thrilling ideas. How do you think of building an economy that's non-violent? How do you think of building, decentralizing the state, etc.? They remain, living challenges. Yeah, and climate change will make Gandhi seem more practical than ever before. Yes. Everyone who said this is impractical, now you have to come around to certain ways of organizing our consumption, which seem very reminiscent of what he had been asking for.
So to conclude, Chandan, is Gandhi going to really survive in that sense? Because that is a thing that some of us deeply think about, and over a period of time, is Gandhi going to be there in that sense? Because as I strongly feel there is only one Gandhi, there cannot be another Mahatma Gandhi. That is my view, but what do you think about it? Since you have read so much, and yesterday you were telling that you taught this subject in the National Law School. Yeah. Your student is here, and you had forgotten about it, and she said that you were the one who taught the subject, Hind Swaraj. So in that sense, what do you feel?
It's a difficult thing. Forecasting is always difficult. But Gandhi himself felt he was articulating what the mass of ordinary Indians are anyway thinking. Let's presume that he's indeed correct in saying that. Then it really depends on how the ordinary Indians will decide to act in response to what things are happening around. So Gandhi is not the individual, but a certain way of thinking about the world. But Gandhi as a figure, he will surely survive. But in what form? There are ways of trying to appropriate him or de-radicalize him, etc., etc. It's an open question, and I'm not even in a position to. But Gandhi not just his fate is not restricted to India alone, right? He's Gandhians all over the world and big leaders. Nelson Mandela was a follower, and I mention him because the recent accusations of racism against Gandhi, Mandela came to his defense, saying that he was a product of his time. People thought like that, but that should not diminish his greatness at all. So I think these are, it's an open thing. But I would think, he will continue to live and inspire and provoke, at least be an irritation, at the very least, of a creative irritation, I would imagine.
Well, thank you. I think time is up. Anyway, it was good that...
Niranjan, one other quick thing. Sorry to interrupt.
No, please,
just
please
thinking about, I think he's also, I see young people here. Gandhi is also important for thinking about how one relates to tradition. He's not a purist. He's all for being creative in ways that make your action seem continuous with what has happened before. And here is a work of an artist, actually, who is not a futurist who says, let's cut loose from tradition, but who will not see tradition as a closed thing. It's an open-ended thing, but it's there. One understands it and work within it, even when you may not really be working within it, but a sense of continuity with what's gone on. So that there's an extraordinary artistic freedom that he presumes in relating to tradition, which I think will be continue to be a very important way. Because modern Indians are constantly having to confront the hard facts or the strong facts of other life forms that surround us in the present and in the past. And Gandhi offers a constructive way out, I think.
Thank you, Chandan. And I'm glad that we just didn't have a few questions. Yeah?
She has a question.
Yeah, Professor Shivana.
She needs a mic. I think we're running out of time.
Can I ask the question?
Yes.
You see, Gandhiji said, the past belongs to us. We don't belong to the past. One question. The second is, he writes his book, My Experiments with Truth. The very title will suggest he's always experimenting with truth as he sees it, and he makes blunders. But he corrects himself, and this was his constant search throughout his life, that is, experimenting with truth. What is it, and how do we achieve it? So whatever is said in Hind Swaraj, he might have developed it or even contradicted later.
Yes.
Because that was his quest. My experiments, the word experiment is the key. So it's a quest for truth. Now, do you think, after your reading of Hind Swaraj, I haven't read it, you think Gandhiji developed even further?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. The constructive program, that booklet I mentioned just a while back, if you look at it, it has 16 items. It's written for the congressman to prepare him for civil disobedience. The first one is, of course, communal harmony. The Hindu-Muslim question weighed uppermost on his mind till the end of his life. The second question is removal of untouchability. And if you see, Hind Swaraj is not interested in untouchability. At that point in time, Gandhi hasn't confronted that fact. So here's one clear evidence of him having evolved since then. And the tribal question is also present in the list of things. Again, they don't matter, they don't figure in the Hind Swaraj discussion. So there are ways in which he's evolving. And we'll have to ask, give her the chance.
So, I want to, I'm just presenting my view regarding Gandhiji, Mahatma, the father of the nation. I'm nothing in front of him, but just a humble presentation. The thing is, I feel, it's my feeling that when they say Gandhiji, it is like an ultimate model, like he is ultimate. You cannot question him, something like that. But how I see as Gandhiji is that, he was a revolutionary. He questioned the system. Even though being a lawyer, he was not limited by logic. He questioned the system. And second thing is somebody who deeply understood India, the roots of India. What is the real India? And his main concept is Swaraj. And he knew the governance, what India needs. Swaraj model as well as everything. He is a complete, what India should be. Whether it is...
What's the question?
The question is that the real Gandhi, the governance part of Gandhi, which completely addresses all issues, whether it is environmental concerns or no corruption or everything. He is the atom of governance, which was not, he should have, my thing is that why he did not become the Prime Minister of India. Instead of giving it to somebody else, when he was so passionately fought for the country, he should have, my question is very relevant. If he had become the Prime Minister of India, the story today about India would have been totally different. So Gandhi is not limited to just the secular. Today, politicians just use just one aspect of Gandhi, that is the secular part of him, and just confuse the debate.
Okay.
But they're not taking up the Swaraj model, using it, anti-corruption, the governance.
I think
And somebody also asked me that is Gandhi going to be relevant? Definitely Gandhi is the relevant thing for today. And he is the thing which has to happen today or tomorrow. It has to happen, the Gandhi model of governance. And I think the present government has also understood it. And they're bringing up something like Gandhipedia.
Okay, yeah.
And what is your thing that they're bringing it up as Gandhipedia?
Okay.
So I want you to talk about the relevance of Gandhi in today's governance.
Okay, thank you. Maybe I hear. Okay. Thank you. I think I'm glad that, you pointed out to how I may not have been more robust. I should have been more robust in saying Gandhi will remain relevant, will surely be. He is, as a thinker, I think his relevance is, higher than ever before. But I was responding to his sort of sociological nudge. Will he survive institutionally, etc.? I was just thinking on those lines. But as a thinker, I think his relevance is, can't be doubted at all.
I think there's just one last question. I'm glad that there are questions about Gandhi still today.
I don't know if it's a question, but in any case, thank you very much for this talk. It's really enlightening. My question is that I see Gandhi as a philosopher, not really at the Mahatma, because it's not my culture, etc. And so I don't worship him, but I admire him for his thoughts. And I'm grateful that, Gandhi finally is a sort of anarchist. I don't know, he doesn't want to lead, and he doesn't want to have followers. He lives as an example. Yes. And for the rest of the world, from people outside India, it has been an immense contribution to humanity. It's not just limited to Indian civilization. And if we talk about civilization, we will see in the next decades how difficult it will be to hold our civilization, which, as you say, is an illusion. It's a consensus that we will have to break because of the difficulties in the environment. This consensus is bad. And I think Gandhi was early realizing that we will not, as humanity, be able to live as the Europeans were proposing.
Thank you, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Niranjan.
So thank you one and all for this, because as you saw, it was a stopgap arrangement. But I'm glad that Chandan, decided to talk about this very relevant issue today. And thanks for the wonderful audience. Of course, more people have come in now to listen to the next session, which is going to be really interesting, I think. Thank you.
Thank you, Niranjan.
Thank you, Chandan Gowda and Niranjan. It was really nice to hear about the relevance of Mahatma Gandhi. I'm sure all of us will go back and ponder on the several points that you've given us. we have Romulus Whittaker, an Indian-American upbringing, a stint at the Vietnam War, crocodiles, snakes, half-wild pig named Luppy, and an emu named Neelakantan, herpetologist, conservationist, Padma Shri awardee. Romulus Whittaker is a man who intrigues, awes, and inspires. Studying king cobras has become a driving force. We think it is an excuse to indulge in what he likes doing the most, wandering in the forest. Janaki Lennon's adventures with her reptile-loving husband, Romulus Whittaker, is beautifully recorded in her trademark irreverent style as she writes tales from the animal world. She's the author of My Husband and Other Animals, A King Cobra's Summer, and My Husband and Other Animals Too. The wildlife adventure continues. Our next panelist, Sunita Dhairyam, is a social activist, painter, designer, entrepreneur, and tiger conservationist. Sunita Dhairyam chose to settle down in her current home, Bandipur, making friends with the creatures of the wild, the villagers, and the tribals. She works to decrease the human-animal conflict and provide relief to villagers whose cattle are killed by the big cats. Welcome. Our next panelist, Harini Nagendra, is an ecologist who examines the factors shaping the social, ecological sustainability of forests and cities in the South Asian context. Harini Nagendra is a professor of sustainability at Azim Premji University. Her previous books include Nature in the City, Bengaluru in the Past, Present, and Future, and Reforesting, Landscapes, Linking Pattern and Process. Seema Mundoli, a senior lecturer at Azim Premji University, has worked with NGOs involved in conservation, mining, land and forest rights, and education in indigenous communities with a focus on tribal areas in the Eastern Ghats. Her recent work examines the relationship between people and nature in cities. Dr. Priya Davidar is a retired professor who received her PhD in zoology under the guidance of Dr. Salim Ali, the renowned ornithologist. She has served on the board of the Wildlife Institute of India, Dehradun, and was a member of the State Wildlife Board of Tamil Nadu. Dr. Davidar conducts ecological research in the Western Ghats and the Andaman Islands. She has published over 100 scientific papers and edited 2 books. An activist in the field of wildlife conservation, she has published over 100 scientific papers and edited 2 books. She is the moderator for today. Thank you. Come, let's listen to what this amazing team has to teach us about the world of the wild, human-animal conflict, and sustainable living.
Good afternoon to you all. It's my great pleasure to moderate this session. I was asked practically at the last moment, so please forgive me if there are some lapses. But the title of the session is Marriages of the Wild, Conservation and Cohabitation. I find that this title is very apt because we are closely tied to nature. And ultimately what happens to ecosystems and species will happen to humans finally. So I thank the organizer of the Mysore Literature Festival for considering such an important topic and by inviting renowned writers and conservationists. So I'll just give a brief background of the conservation scene as I perceive it at least. And then I'll talk briefly about the authors and then they'll take over and develop their narrative on how they came about to write such important pieces of work. So as we are all aware, we are in the midst of a sixth mass extinction. So species are disappearing rapidly, both on land and water. And this is mostly fueled by the expanding human footprint throughout the globe. So scientists have predicted that we are likely to lose about 30 to 50% of Earth's species by the middle of the century. So what we have is not just a century or millennia, we just have decades to try and salvage what we can. So this is a very urgent situation. So there is an imperative to promote coexistence between humans and nature. That's why the title says cohabitation. Animals and plants are mostly victims of our fear and greed. They're not really competitors, except maybe in a few cases. So it is timely to ask where we are going and to highlight the efforts of individuals in addressing some of the challenges we face with the environment. So the authors here have made tremendous contributions in improving our understanding of nature through their writings and in the media, and in promoting coexistence between us and other forms of life. We extend a warm welcome to them all. So firstly, even though Prithvi has given an introduction, I'll give another introduction to each of them, and then I'll ask them to talk about what motivated their work and where they want to go from now. So first I'll talk about these two young ladies, that is Harini Nagendra and Seema Mundali, who have written a very important book on trees called Trees and Canopies. So we all know that plants and maybe some microorganisms are most underrated on Earth. But these are the basis of life, actually. So a recent study has estimated that 571 plant species have gone extinct over the past 250 years, and this extinction rate is likely to accelerate due to both deforestation and climate change. And when we go to the urban scene, which they have also tackled, we see that trees that take hundreds of years to grow are mindlessly cut down. So this book that they have written describes many of the trees in India, among which are the banyan, which is a sacred tree actually, and considered a keystone species because it supports so much other life with it. And this book will appeal to readers of all ages. It's a fresh, breezy cocktail that lifts one's spirits and yet sadly reminds us of our loss. And also scientists have seen that large, old, big trees are rapidly disappearing from the Earth's surface. So with these large trees will go a lot of other species as well. So please, can I ask both of you, maybe one after the other, to talk a bit about your book and what motivated you?
First of all, ಎಲ್ಲರಿಗೂ ನಮಸ್ಕಾರ. ಮೈಸೂರಲ್ಲಿ ಮಾತಾಡಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಬಹಳ ಸಂತೋಷ. Very happy to be in Mysore. It's a great pleasure, especially because my urban research, as Priya and many others here may know, I started my research in 1993-94 on a lot of forest cover in India and looking at forest biodiversity and changes in land use and land cover. But in 2007 or so, I'm from Bangalore, and I got very interested in understanding what changes are going on in the city, because as all of us know, if you can do a quick hand check, I do this often. How many of you were born in cities? Okay. How many of your grandparents were born in cities? Grandparents were born in cities. You can see the change yourselves, right? So we are a nation that is fast moving towards the urban. And I started thinking about how we needed to, if we really need to tackle the issues of biodiversity loss, we can't ignore our cities. This is not to say that conservation must focus on cities, but it can't ignore cities. And up till now, it's been changing in the past 5-7 years, but up till now, conservation is almost exclusively focused on what we thought of as wilderness areas. And there really is no place of wilderness, if you're thinking of wilderness as a place without human beings, but especially so in cities. So with that, my first book, which is Nature in the City, Bengaluru in the Past, Present and Future, which is an ecological history of Bangalore as it changed from the 5th, 6th century onwards. It's very similar to Mysore, but Bangalore is a bit different because Bangalore is at the cusp of the Malnad and the Bailu, the Malnad being the hills and the Bailu being the area that is more similar to the Mysore area, which is sort of flatter. And so in that coexistence of these ecological regimes, how did Bangalore change from what it was in the 5th, 6th century, which is the first time we start finding stone inscriptions and copper plate inscriptions to understand the landscape, to see to where we got of Bangalore today, and what this can tell us about Bangalore in the future. And one of the reasons I'm very happy to be in Mysore is because Mysore, as an old Bangalorean, reminds me so much of what Bangalore used to be in the past. In fact, I just met an old school friend of mine today, and I was saying that we escape, my family and I try and escape from Bangalore as often as we can on weekends and on holidays to Mysore, just because it really reminds us of how Bangalore used to be in the past in a different kind of place. But what interested me when I started writing Nature in the City and then talking to people about Bangalore and ecological changes is the number of people in cities who are very passionate about nature. And that's not probably necessarily surprising, but if you think of it, there are psychologists and journalists who've talked about what they call as nature deficit disorder. They say that if you grow up in cities, starved of access to nature, then your brains, especially as children, get rewired in very different ways. So if you look at nature deficit disorder, what is urbanization in India going to do to that rewiring? At that time, Seema and I started talking about doing a popular book on cities, which is the Cities in Canopies that is here. Unfortunately, for some reason, both of these are not available in the bookstores here, but please do look for them. They're available in other places in Mysore and also on Amazon. But Cities in Canopies is a more popular book on trees, and in this we try to do something very different. We are saying there is a science, but all of us relate to trees or to nature through emotion also. So we have recipes, grandmother's recipes for hair oil that comes from trees. We have recipes for Ugadi Pachadi. We have, memories, we have poems, we have songs, we have histories, stories of people, riddles, and the deep science. And so I'd like to end with this, just saying that I think when we interact with nature or with wildlife, it is with wonderment and it is with the science. So how can we marry the two to kind of deepen our attachment to nature in this era of the Anthropocene when we have biodiversity extinction? That is really the focus of what I have. And I'll just end with one thing. We have some nice postcards with some lovely sketches of the book. There are about 50 of them. I don't have more, unfortunately. I'll leave them on the table here. As you're going, the first 50 who want to pick this up, please do.
So thank you, Harini. Thank you very much. One thing I wanted to ask you, with the trees disappearing and the increasing urbanization, are the species, the fauna, is it also changing?
Absolutely, and there's always going to be some fauna that thrive in cities. The pigeons and the crows are very good examples, and the cockroaches. A number of other fauna, like the urban slender loris, for instance, which is now, it's very difficult to see them survive. But there's also the fact that 40% of our protected areas are now within an hour's drive of cities. So what does this do to wildlife? Leopards, we were talking in the panel, leopards, elephants coming into the cities are going to become an increasingly common thing of the future. And we can't focus on relocating cities outside protected areas. So we have to look at what makes certain kinds of species thrive and certain other kinds of species go extinct from cities.
Good afternoon, everybody, and it's really great to be here in Mysore. So I never intended to write a book, but when Harini said, why don't we just, I only intended to read books, but she said, why don't we write a book on trees? And the instant answer was yes. And I guess the reason for that is that I am a campus child. I grew up in a campus, in a university campus, sitting on trees, running, not the Bollywood style, but running around trees literally every day almost, having feasts, mango feasts and gooseberry feasts. Somewhere, and I did not follow an ecology or a science-based career, moved from corporate sector to the Kroc Bank and to different NGOs. But when we moved to the city, these trees are something that have been a constant. They stand still, of course, but they've also been a constant in my life. Everywhere I've gone, I've been interested in them. But something that happened in Bangalore is that it's known as a garden city. And during the course of our research, during the time I started working with Harini in the urban areas, there were a lot of these development debates that were going on in the city. Every time there was a road construction, a steel flyover construction, anything, the first thing that they would do, the first news we would hear is that X number of trees are going to be cut, and then there's followed by a slew of citizen protests. And it seems to be a pattern that was constantly repeating itself. But we also saw at the same time that as much as there was a concern, there was this push to cut trees, there was an equal pushback from the people saying that we want trees. But many people did not, and we realized that people relate to trees in very different ways. There's a cultural relation, there's an ecological relation to it, there's the science-based relation to it. And we found these very, very interesting ways that people interact with it. It's not uniform. They do, for example, there's a Ficus racemosa gular tree outside my house. When I'm leaving the house in the morning, there's somebody praying on it. In the afternoon, the watchmen are sitting and drinking chai. In the evening, the bats are feasting on the fig. So a single tree had so many multiple uses. And so what we also wanted to look at in the book is the larger question of where do trees stand in the face of development? What is the kind of trade? Do we always have to make a trade-off between a flyover and trees? And what are the ways in which we can get a voice for trees in the city? So there are a lot of debates that we try to address about invasive and exotic species. The eucalyptus is such a much maligned species, but so but there are so many exotics that have also been naturalized. So how can we look at trees from a larger development angle, but at the same time relate to it very personally? So it was, and as for me, the most interesting part was, of course, memories that were triggered, childhood memories, and also doing the archival research. It was fascinating. So we've sort of scored the archives, forest research in Dehradun, the British Library, name it, and we've gone and we've picked up these nuggets about how the Britishers how did they perceive shade, for example? What was their decisions on tree planting? Are we replicating some of this? Does that replication make sense now? And what kind of an outlook do we need to have for trees in the cities, that because urbanization is given now, we are moving into a very urban, so that's possibly the main motivations and the content.
Thank you very much, Seema. One thing I wanted to ask you, trees are being cut in many places, and there's a lot of citizen protests. And the excuse they always give is that they are going to plant new trees. Are the new trees that they plant, are they equivalent to the old trees that they cut down?
So most definitely not. So there are many elements to this. One is that you are cutting a mature tree that provided so many services, and which it had probably taken maybe 60, 70, 100 years to grow, and it has itself become a species that supports so much biodiversity. And what is the point of planting 60,000, so the steel flyover was one example, 2,000 trees were going to be cut approximately, they said they'll plant 60,000 saplings somewhere else. But the pollution is in the cities. So there's really no point in taking the trees and planting them in some other place where there is no, because trees do help mitigate, and the species, the choice of species they use are these fast-growing species often, not maybe more relevant native species.
Thank you very much, Seema. So now I would like to introduce Sunita Dhairyam, who's the epitome of a person who thinks globally and acts locally. She's an artist, designer, conservationist who ultimately promotes human-wildlife coexistence through her art, advocacy, and interventions to save species like the tigers by providing compensation for livestock predation. She's a true entrepreneur establishing temple tree designs whose products many of us sport. In fact, I like going to her shops. And Mariamma, she also has the Mariamma Charitable Trust to support the health, education, and livelihoods of local communities. So Sunita, I'd like you to tell us a bit of what inspires and motivates you.
Hello, everybody. It's great to be here. Thank you for having me here. Not so sure I belong here, but I'm here. Couldn't get out of it, but anyway. I just, stumbled. I'm a wildlife artist, and I just stumbled into my work, actually. It was just because I felt that there was a need to do the work that I do. And since I have lived in Mangla village now for 22 years, it's my home. And I started the Mariamma Charitable Trust purely out of need, really. A member medical charity started a clinic from my farm in the year 2000, and it was then that the bridge between the local people and myself lessened a bit, and they started approaching me for help in taking photographs. At that time, there was no cell phones, and so people started asking me if I could come and take photographs of their animals that were killed by any of the big cats, and I started doing it. And I waited for about 7 years to see if there was any help coming their way. And I realized that there was not. So in the year 2007, I registered the charity, which is the Marima Charitable Trust, which is named after the local temple. So it's, to the local people, it's not really me, it's Marima, who's doing all this work, and it's her that's, so they're able to connect with her much more than with me. And so I registered that in the year 2007, and then I realized, oh my God, what am I going to do about money? I mean, nobody was going to come and help me at all. So I have to mention that it was the Karnataka Forest Department who actually, my life was justified living there, because they're the ones who were employing me as an artist. Every now and again, they would hire me to paint something, and I was able to justify and earn a living being an artist in that area. So I have to thank them for that, that support that they gave me, and until today, they still give that to me. So then I realized that I needed to raise the funds for the work that was being done. So I went and worked in Tirupur for 3 months in a factory to learn the different ways and techniques of making T-shirts and so on and so forth. And then I started designing stuff for that and started selling, and realized that, wow, I was able to earn a living doing this and earning the money for the charity that was needed. So that's what we did. And today I managed to pay compensation for people, and it's just an interim relief, really, because the department does pay compensation, but I try and support the people by giving it immediately. And then they follow the procedures of putting in the application and so on and so forth, and the department gives the rest of the money. And we still run the charity, the clinic for the charity, which is now, we are 19th year going on, and we look after patients from many, many villages around. And we try to help, when we have the funds, we try to help people with education, if we can. There is another organization called Namasanga out there who does support education and other things. So that's what I do, basically. So basically, we just try and be a support to the local people and the local populations there.
Thank you very much, Surita. One question I'd like to ask you. Are you planning to expand to other areas? I know you act locally,
Yes.
but
Yes,
there's a value in what you do elsewhere.
Yes, now people from far and wide are actually coming in, and I have to say that I am now in the process of signing an MOU with WWF India. Wow. So we will be working in Tamil Nadu, in the probably about 10 or 12 villages in Tamil Nadu also, which is fairly high conflict. So they will be helping me for a year or two in paying compensations. After that, again, we have the worry of where do we get the funds, because once I start doing this, so I will be employing more local people in the Mudamalai side, yeah. And we will be increasing our, and now that, it's been now 12 years, so people are hearing, oh, this is happening. So people are coming from far and wide for help in so many aspects. If not only in compensation, but in 2 days ago, a man was killed by an elephant in a village about 27 kilometers away. It was at 1:10 in the morning. The first people they called was us to call the department, which we did. So it's a little help for the department also.
Try to coordinate between the
quite right, as much as we can.
Very important.
Yeah, as much as we can.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And keep up the good work. So next is Janaki Lennon, who's a renowned filmmaker, journalist, publisher, and naturalist, who's the author of the books My Husband and Other Animals, which have received huge popular success. We didn't know, Ram, which kind of animal are you, Ram? So these books are a mixture of stories recounting the adventure and excitement of living with Ram Whittaker amidst a menagerie of animals. So the books are very informative, entertaining, and whimsical, providing startling insights into animal behavior as well as the foibles of human nature. It doesn't. Oh, it started, yeah. And with her husband Ram has produced more than a dozen films for National Geographic Television, So Janaki, please tell us about yourself and what motivates you to be so extremely productive and with such a high impact.
Hello. I'm not a conservationist, everybody else on this, but I call myself an Asian provocateur. So I ask diplomatically incorrect questions, as my friends will tell you here. So when I first met Rom, that was my first serious window into the world of wildlife and conservation, and I was always intrigued by what these people do. Why do they do what they do? What is this that drives them to give up personal comforts and live in a camp in the forest being rained on and bitten by ticks and leeches? I mean, who in their right minds would ever do something like that? I mean, I still don't know, but so, it came down to one thing. So the one question that runs through everything I write is, are we part of nature or are we separate from nature? And what is nature? How do you define nature? Okay, you could say there are, but what about rats? Are they wildlife? Cockroaches? Fully justified, yeah. So we have this kind of prejudice when it comes to species. We say nature, but we say some are acceptable nature and the others are vermin deserving to be exterminated. So this whole, the mixed reactions that we have towards nature, quote unquote, it fascinates me. Why do people react the way they do to what's out there? How do they see themselves? What is their relationship to that thing out there? And that's what I do. And I can't claim to have any answers, but it's taken me on a very interesting journey. That's all I can say. Thank you.
So, pardon me. So you grew up in an urban setting, is it?
Yeah, I was born and brought up in a city, didn't know any wild animal until I met the chief wild animal.
Yeah. So how did you adapt to all these different forms of life, including snakes and reptiles and all that?
Okay.
Has it been an easy adaptation?
So I'm fundamentally a storyteller. This is all grist for the mill. It doesn't matter if I have to undergo some trauma. Yeah, it's later on. It's always nicer.
Makes a good
telling.
story.
Yeah,
As long as
exactly.
there's a story in there.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. Now I'll come to Rom. So,
Can you hear me?
So Rom, of course, doesn't need any introduction. And we have known each other since the 70s. And he's always been such a charismatic, creative, outgoing person, extremely adventurous. And he's been made more famous and infamous by the books that his wife writes. So Rom is an inspirational figure for wildlife conservationists, herpetologists. So he was among the first in India to educate people about snakes. Before that, the only reaction you had when you saw a snake was, let's it. But Rom, through his work and through the Madras Snake Park and the Crocodile Bank, he reduced public fear about snakes. So this was a tremendous contribution to the conservation of reptiles. And he established the Madras Snake Park, the Madras Crocodile Bank, which has achieved tremendous success in research and education about reptiles. And his latest work is also very fascinating on the variation in venom types within the same species of snakes in different regions in India. So it's a tremendous insight into snake biology. So one of his landmark achievements was to establish the Irula Snake Catchers Cooperative Society in 1978, which gave a very important source of livelihood to the Irula communities who used to live off catching and selling, killing snakes and selling the skin. But instead now they catch snakes, extract the venom, put the snakes back in nature, and very important for making the serum anti-venom. So, so among his achievements are numerous publications and films. He has co-authored The Snakes of India, the field guide with Ashok Captain, where 276 species of the currently 302 described have been documented. So he's achieved so much that it will take a long time, maybe half the day, to list all his achievements. But one thing I want to tell you one story very recently. About 2 weeks ago, I live in the jungle with my husband, so we live among snakes and elephants and all that. So our gardener, actually, who's Irula, he came running and he said he's seen a snake. So I said, what type of snake? He said, oh, it is like that, this thick, long, and with all sorts of things. So then I gave him your book. He was absolutely fascinated, you know. He went leafing through the book, and then he managed to identify the snake, which turned out to be Russell's viper. So this is the impact that ROM has had on everyone, including people who are illiterate, as we say. I mean, it's not a derogatory term, but these poor people living in the forest often cannot read and write. So I'll let him now talk about his adventures.
I just want to say namaskara, sapakara, batara. But since Tamil is my native language, I'll speak in English. I had the great fortune of coming to India when I was just 7 years old with my mother and my stepfather. My stepfather was Ram, son of Kamala. So I'm related to a fantastic, illustrious family, which has served me very well. I go around sort of name-dropping left and right. No, but seriously, I came to India already smitten by snakes. I was 4 years old, catching snakes in northern New York State, a little village called Hoosick, right near the Vermont border. And I came home with a snake one day, and my mother snapped a picture to this day of this little brat bringing a snake home. He said, wow, how beautiful. Love snakes after that reaction from my mother. Land of cobras. I grew up in Bombay in a missionary school, so I got a heavy dose of Christianity. And we're talking about real wild. Yeah, so growing up in the West just became a lover of the forest and jungle to the great detriment of my studies. I managed to pass through. I even went to anyway, I quit that, and from Florida, the largest gun production center in the world, Haas was the owner, and I had this germ of an idea. India is the land of snakes back home. And the first thing I did, wander around, I set up a small gun in Bombay, a place called where I had already learned Tamil when I was a little kid, so it was next to their skins, and as Priya just told you, the snake numbers, I mean, doesn't matter. They were really slaughtering snakes. So there was a big campaign just came in 1972, and then they were without a job. So I set up the Madras Snake Park in 1969, and then again, talking about forest departments, in this case it was the Tamil Nadu Forest Department, who said, hey, we've got a national park in the middle of the city called Windy Deer Park. Would you like a ½ an acre of land to set up your snake park there? I just couldn't believe it. And here I was still an American citizen in those days, so was it legal for the forest department to give ½ an acre of reserve park, national park to a foreigner? Don't tell anybody. So, it was all a long time ago, so it's all been done. Anyway, we set up the snake park, and the first people came through. 1 million visitors. Okay, snakes. Maybe people have negative attitudes toward them, but they are fascinated by them. Everyone has to agree with that. And over the years, people started coming around, especially young people, several people who were supposed to be seriously going to IIT, for example, or seriously trying to become engineers, totally dropped out and joined me. who also became Mr. Garia. Started studying Gario up in North India, joined the Forest Department. Another, Satish Bhaskar, whom you may have heard of, became Mr. Sea Turtle of India. And these are guys who were just palling around with me at the snake park in those days. Those are just two of many who went on to do great things. Probably could be called one of India's first lady herpetologists, J. Vijaya, who rediscovered a rare species of turtle in Kerala. She was one of the wonderful people who worked with me there. So it kicked off quite a movement, and quite a few people got involved. Also, what was happening was I was doing surveys, and I must admit that WWF at that time chipped in grants. We got a magnificent grant of 3,000 rupees. No, wait a minute, in those days it was something. In 1972, 73, it took me to Gario was supposed to still be found. But Gario were almost on the verge of extinction. We could count only 170 Gario left. And that was really serious stuff. We're down to, what might just go extinct tomorrow. So when my ex-wife, Zara Whitaker, and I set up what's called the Madras Crocodile Bank, and a lot of you have probably been there, and this has worked out really well because we started with just 14 crocodiles, and not knowing that crocodiles are actually rabbits in disguise, they started breeding like mad. Okay, go there now, and you can count 2,200 crocodiles. What to do with them? We started releasing them in the wild. We released about 1,500 muggers, many Gario in various protected areas around the country. And as we all know, what was conservation then, I may not like to use the word, has become conflict now. Because there was a whole generation of people who lived without knowing how to live with crocodiles. So really a lot of conservation now is teaching people how to live with these animals again. And that gets me into snakes again, okay? Snakes were always my first love, and snake bite is an incredible problem in India. Snakes are very, very valuable in ecosystems. The only creature that really can control rats. You might think that cats are good rat catchers. Forget it. Cats can't go down into the rat holes and kill all the rats down in there. Snakes do every day. So, yeah, they're very, very important. But they're also an animal which has become very common in rice fields and in villages because of various reasons. For one thing, waste attract millions and millions of rats, and of course the snakes follow. So we've got a huge problem with snake bite in India. Snakes kill as many as 50,000 people every year in India. This figure comes from something called the Million Death Study, which was a really interesting study on the basis of what's called verbal autopsy. Have you heard of this before? It's very interesting. You send a doctor and a social worker to 1 million households and find out what are the causes of death in the family. And this is the data that they came up with. So with 50,000 people dying of snake bite in India and a couple of 100,000 being permanently injured, we've got a big, big problem. And we're now, this Croc Bank and a lot of our partners around the country are involved in a very, very heavy-duty snake bite mitigation program consisting of education and collecting venom samples and testing antivenom and stuff like that. I mean, those of you who are interested, get in touch with me at kingcobra@gmail.com for easy. And I would really appreciate your association with us and whatever partnership we can build to stop this snake bite problem. Yeah? That's about it for the moment.
Thank you, Ram. That was really nice story about your life and your work. So there is a sort of perception that snakes are declining in the wild. What do you think about that? Are they increasing?
Snakes? That's a really good question. Unfortunately, there's no census taken on snakes. I mean, we need a good snake census officer to get out there and do some censusing. But yes, certainly in urban areas, snakes are under very great pressure, as any wildlife. But in rural areas, the snakes that are in trouble are the snakes in forest areas like rainforests, which have been destroyed at a rapid pace. I believe the figure is something like 80% of the high rainfall forests in the Western Ghats have been destroyed over the last 50 years. And these are the places where king cobras, pythons, Europe belt, it's species of snakes which need particular kinds of habitats to live. Our other snakes like cobras and Russell's vipers, they're very happy in our rice fields. And rat snakes, of course.
Thank you very much to all our speakers. I would now like to throw the questions open to the floor. So if any of you have any questions, yeah.
So I'd like to ask a question about something that was addressed earlier on. So it's related to funding really on conservation. So we see certain animals which aren't necessarily very ecologically important, but say cute, something like say the giant panda, which is literally the face of wildlife conservation, the logo of WWF, which gets millions of dollars of funding each year. But things that are like less cute or less animate, such as say moss or say a small salamander, which are much more ecologically important for the biodiversity of that area, which don't get nearly enough funding. The same goes for trees. As ma'am said, that big corporates, through their CSR activities, they fund fast-growing or aesthetically pleasing trees, but don't really recognize the trees that really do benefit the local ecology the most. So how do you think we can bring more awareness to this issue on funding things that will help the species that are the most ecologically important, will help the environment the most instead of what just looks pleasing? How do you think we'll bring about this sort of awareness?
Okay, so obviously we can't speak to all of conservation. Maybe we can try and get a set of opinions between us. But you're very right. I mean, I think this is the catch of dealing with the human side of conservation. We have to speak to the emotion within us, but emotion is also biased. And then we have to figure out how to speak to that biased. So a lot of, I think, what ecologists try to do is package it within the concept of keystone species, essentially saying, okay, a tiger and an elephant might get you the money for conservation, but within that you're trying to conserve the habitat that also brings the salamander. But then what do you do about things like bees and butterflies, pollinators? We know we're running out of pollinators. What do we do about frogs? Amphibians are, nobody's going to give you a lot of money for a very nice, exciting campaign to conserve frogs. Yeah, or moss.
Things change with time. Like when Rom started working with snakes and crocodiles, nobody would have given him a dime. I mean, why would you conserve snakes? But now it ranks high on the popularity list. So tastes of people change, things come into fashion, and you do the best you can with it. And I guess my role as a storyteller, I can see, because when you package it like that, like the keystone umbrella, it then becomes so much about that, and it doesn't even range of forests or terrain need help.
There's a last question for him, ma'am.
Yeah.
Can I? Research that you did in the King Cobra research.
Snake, it's not a good idea because you can't go anywhere. They do internally. And it's a very simple operation. It takes about 10 minutes to put 7 king cobras in Forest Research Station. And in this time of year, it's incredible. The rain is non-stop. You wash your clothes, trials and tribulations. But the beautiful thing about it, the project, is unique among all snake projects in the world. It's so secretive. It's very visible, and you can see everything that he does. Okay, anyway. Able to see exactly what the king luckily they happen to wake up very conveniently at 8 a.m. It's had a rough day all day in the rain.
So, anyway, the king couldn't be me. Hello, hello. And just to give you an example, one of the first snakes we tracked, we have code names for them, M3. He was male, so he was M3. During the monsoon, he didn't go out into the rice fields to find rat snake. Oh, first of all, I must tell you, kinks, okay? Yes, they are name Ophiophagous, which tells us evolution close to snakes. But anyway, that's a digression. M3 ate 26 pit vipers during a period of 2 months during the monsoon, the first monsoon that we followed him. And these guys who were tracking them got to see every single predation. And he would have an incredible sense of smell with that long tongue of theirs. And a pit viper would walk, and the tree, even follow it, swim across a stream, and find that find that pit viper, catch him and eat him. I mean, once this king cobra's on the trail, that guy is out. That pit viper hasn't got a prayer. Anyway, so this is, I mean, that gives you a little idea, Gombe. I mean, all of you, and join in. You can become a volunteer on the King Cobra project, and you'll be very welcome. Try not to come during the monsoon in your first visit, okay? Okay. Okay, please do. Thanks very much. I've got to zip out and talk to some children. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rom. We can take about 2 or 3 questions, short questions. If anyone else, yes, please.
Hello. Well, there are 3 concepts that bug me, and any one of you can answer this question. The first one is the concept of ahimsa, non-violence even with animals. And so, and it's a sacred kind of a concept. It has religious connotations as well. This is one. The second one is struggle for existence, where you find each animal a kind of a predator to another animal. And so it's one animal killing the other, which goes completely counter to ahimsa. And this is a creation of nature or God, whichever way. The third is that today we realize that even plants have feelings and the trees have feelings. Now, that means you cannot cut any plant. You're committing a kind of murder. Now, with these 3 in mind, I don't know how to reconcile them, but the question is, how do we live? Tell me, please.
The issue is that we are part of the food chain. We are also another animal. We are a species, so we have to eat plants or animals or whatever to survive. We are not gods or beyond nature. We are part of nature. So it's individual choice, I think. You know, we feel badly that we have to kill some spinach or something and make a palak, but what to do? I mean, no answer. No answer.
You can't live on fresh air.
Can't live on fresh air, yeah, right.
I'd like to thank all our panelists. Thank you very much for being a part of this panel. I'd like to request Ryan Irani and Hanmant to please give small gifts to our panelists. Thank you, Priya, for being such a wonderful moderator. Thank you. Thank you, Sunita Thairyam, Seema Mundoli. Thank you for being here. Harini Nagendra and Janaki Lennon. I have an artist here who has sketched all of you on stage while he was sitting here and watching you. So just want to show it to you guys. Harsha, can you just come up?
Thank you. I really enjoyed your talk. Yeah. So,
One postcard.
After a while, it was suspicious. I knew you were drawing. You couldn't be studiously taking down notes for so long.
Do I look like the kind who will take notes?
I know you, so it's possible.
Yeah, yeah.
Very nice.
I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Shall we stand for a picture?
Yeah, sure.
And Harsha,
Yeah?
can you send
Sure,
me a
sure.
WhatsApp of that?
Perfect, perfect.
Just to all of us.
Yeah, yeah, sure. I'll do one thing. I'll give it to Prithvi, the organizer, and she'll like forward it.
Great. Lovely. What a good job.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you, everyone. We're getting into the next session. The last session for the Lit Fest. This is postcards.
Geeta Bhaskar straddles two cultures, and her writings explore human relationship in a global world. From this space that she inhabits, she watches her characters jug of life. Sujata Rajpal, professional